Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Marcus Thornfield, and I've been a ranger at Denali National Park for 19 years. In all that time, I've pulled 847 people out of situations that should have killed them. Avalanches, bear attacks, hypothermia so bad their hearts stopped beating. I've seen it all. I always prided myself on being the guy who could explain away the unexplainable. Native stories about shadow creatures and shapeshifters, just old tales to keep people from wandering too far into the wilderness. I was wrong about everything. It was March of 1987, and the Alaskan winter was holding on tight. The temperature had been sitting at 40 below for 3 weeks straight, and we were still getting 18 hours of darkness each day. In the Kontishna Hills, 60 miles from the nearest road, that kind of cold and dark can kill you faster than you can think. That's where the Geological Survey team went missing. Dr. Sarah Chen and her 2 graduate students had been out there for 5 days, taking core samples from the old mining sites. Standard procedure called for radio check-ins every 12 hours. When they missed their 3rd call, we knew something was wrong. I remember standing in the ranger station that morning, looking at the weather reports on my desk. The wind was howling outside, like something alive and angry. My partner Jake Riverstone was getting his gear ready, checking his Motorola MT500 radio for the dozenth time. "Could be equipment failure," Jake said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. "Maybe they're just hunkered down somewhere, waiting for the storm to pass." I wanted to believe that. Jake and I had worked together for 8 years, and he was the best wilderness tracker I'd ever known. Half Athabascan, half Irish, and 100% reliable in a crisis. If anyone could find these people alive, it was him. But something felt wrong from the start. The last GPS coordinates we had from Dr. Chen put her team near Quigley Ridge, close to some of the old gold mine shafts from the 1892. It was rough country, even in summer, in March. With the snow 6 feet deep and the wind chill hitting 60 below, it was like stepping onto another planet. My grandmother used to tell me stories about that area. She was Athabascan, from the village of Minchumina, and she'd grown up hearing the old warnings. "Stay away from the places where the white men dug into the earth," she'd say. "The Kushtaka, remember everything. Kushtaka. Shapeshifters, creatures that could look like anyone, sound like anyone, but weren't human at all. Just hungry things wearing human faces." I never believed those stories. I was a modern man with modern training, wilderness first aid, GPS navigation, radio protocols. I dealt in facts, not folklore. The helicopter couldn't fly in that weather, so Jake and I loaded up our snowshoes and headed out on foot. 3 days to reach the search area, if the weather held. We packed enough food for a week, emergency shelter, medical supplies, and 2 emergency position indicating radio beacons, in case our main communications went down. The first day of hiking was rough but normal. We followed the old mining trail, stopping every hour to check our compass bearings and radio back to base. The snow was deep and powdery, perfect for tracking. We should have seen signs, animal prints, broken branches, anything that showed life in the area. But there was nothing. No tracks, no scat, no scratch marks on the trees. Even the ravens, which usually followed us hoping for scraps, were nowhere to be found. "Quiet out here," Jake said during our second rest stop. He was scanning the tree line with his binoculars, looking for movement. "Too quiet," I agreed. In 19 years of wilderness work, I'd never seen country this empty. Even in the dead of winter, there should have been something, a ptarmigan track, the trail of a fox, evidence that life existed here. But the snow around us was perfect and unmarked, like we were the first living things to pass this way in years. That should have been our first warning. We found Dr. Chen's base camp on the afternoon of the 2nd day. It was set up in a small clearing near the ridge, 3 expedition-quality tents arranged in a neat triangle around a cold fire pit. Everything looked normal from a distance, too normal. "Something's off," Jake said as we approached. He'd stopped about 50 yards out, his head tilted like he was listening for something. I knew what he meant. The tents were still standing, which was good. No bear damage, no obvious signs of struggle. But there was something about the way the camp was arranged that made my skin crawl. The tents were positioned perfectly, like someone had taken great care to make everything look exactly right. "Dr. Chen," I called out. "This is Ranger Thornfield with Search and Rescue." No answer. The wind had died down, and my voice carried clearly across the clearing. If anyone was alive in those tents, they would have heard me. Jake was walking a wide circle around the camp, reading the snow like a book. He'd been tracking since he was 8 years old, and he could tell you what an animal had eaten for breakfast just by looking at its prints. "Marcus," he called, "you need to see this." I snowshoed over to where he was standing. He was looking down at the snow, his face pale under his winter hat. "What is it?" "Look at the tracks." I looked. There were tracks. All right, human boot prints leading from each tent toward the center of the camp. But they were wrong somehow. The prints were too deep, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. And they all ended at the same spot, right where the fire pit was. But there were no tracks leading away from the fire pit. None at all. "Where did they go?" I asked. Jake shook his head. "That's not the weird part. Look closer at the prints." I got down on one knee and studied the tracks. They were clear and sharp, made in snow that had to be at least 2 days old based on the ice crystals that had formed around the edges. But the pattern was all wrong. The tracks from the first tent belonged to hiking boots, size 9 or 10. The tracks from the second tent were the same size, same pattern. The tracks from the third tent? Also identical. 3 different people, I said slowly, all wearing the exact same boots. "That's impossible," Jake said. "Even if they bought their boots from the same place, there'd be wear patterns, different lacing, something to tell them apart." I stood up and looked around the clearing again. The trees surrounding us were perfectly still, but I had the strangest feeling that something was watching us from the shadows between the trunks. "Let's check the tents," I said. The first tent was Dr. Chen's. I knew because her name was written on a piece of duct tape stuck to the door. Flap. Inside, everything was neat and organized. Sleeping bag rolled up, research notes stacked in a waterproof case, personal items arranged on a small camp table. No signs of struggle, no indication that she'd left in a hurry. But her boots were still there, sitting right by the door, like she'd taken them off before going to sleep. "Jake," I called, "she's not wearing boots." "Neither are the other 2, he called back from the second tent. "All their gear is here. Food, clothes, everything. Like they just walked out in their socks." That's when I heard it. A voice calling from somewhere in the forest. "Help me, please, someone help me." It was a woman's voice, thin and desperate. Jake and I looked at each other across the camp. "Dr. Chen?" I called back. "I'm hurt. I can't move. Please help me." The voice was coming from the north, deeper into the forest. Jake was already grabbing his medical kit. "Wait," I said. Something about the voice bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "She's hurt, Marcus. We have to go." He was right, of course. We were search and rescue. When someone called for help, we went. That was the job. But as we followed the voice into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The voice kept calling, always seeming to come from just ahead of us, just out of sight. We followed it for 20 minutes, breaking trail through snow that got deeper with every step. "I'm here. Keep coming. I think my leg is broken." Jake was ahead of me, following the sound. But something made me stop and look back toward the camp. From where we stood, I could barely see the orange of the tents through the trees. "Jake," I said, "look at our trail." He turned around and followed my gaze. Behind us, our snowshoe tracks cut a clear line through the pristine snow. But we'd been hiking in a straight line for 20 minutes. The tracks should have led directly back to the camp. Instead, they curved and wandered, doubling back on themselves in places, like we'd been walking in circles. "That's not possible," Jake said. "I was following my compass the whole time." I looked down at my own compass. The needle was spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. "From somewhere ahead of us, Doctor." Chen's voice called out again. "Please, I'm so cold, don't leave me here." But this time, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The voice was coming from behind us. from the exact spot where we'd just been standing. We made it back to the camp, just as darkness was falling. Jake set up our shelter while I tried to raise base on the radio, but all I got was static. The GPS was still showing impossible readings. According to the display, we were somehow 300 feet underground. "Equipment's screwed," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Must be mineral deposits or something." I wanted to believe that. Magnetic anomalies weren't uncommon in old mining areas. The iron ore in the rock could throw off compass readings, and sometimes that interfered with radio signals too. But it didn't explain the voice we'd heard, or the tracks that led nowhere. We ate dinner in uncomfortable silence, heating MREs over a small camp stove. Every few minutes, one of us would look up from our food and scan the tree line. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was getting stronger. "Tell me about the Kushtaka," I said finally. Jake looked surprised. "Why?" "My grandmother used to mention them. Said this area was dangerous." Jake stirred his beef stew, not meeting my eyes. "Old stories. Shapeshifters from the coast. Supposed to be half otter, half human. They'd lure fishermen to their deaths by mimicking voices of people they loved." "But those are just stories, right?" "That's what I used to think." Jake set down his spoon. "But my grandfather claimed he saw one once when he was young. Said it looked like his dead brother, calling to him from across a river. When he tried to cross over, the thing showed its true face. Rows of sharp teeth and eyes like black water. A branch cracked somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. We both grabbed our flashlights, scanning the forest. The beams cut through the night, illuminating snow-covered trees and empty shadows. Nothing there. Just the cold," I said. "Makes the wood contract." But even as I said it, I was thinking about the voice we'd heard earlier, Dr. Chen calling for help, leading us in circles through the forest. How had she known we were coming? How had she known to call for help at the exact moment we found her camp? And where was she now? I was still thinking about that when I heard my brother's voice. "Marcus? Marcus, is that you?" I nearly dropped my flashlight. Tommy had died 15 years ago in a climbing accident on McKinley. I'd been the one who found his body. "Marcus, I'm lost. I can't find my way back to camp." Jake was staring at me. "You hear that?" I nodded, unable to speak. "Help me, Marcus. I'm scared." The voice was coming from the same direction we'd heard Dr. Chen earlier. But it was definitely Tommy's voice, the slight stutter he'd had as a kid, the way he pronounced my name with the emphasis on the second syllable. "It's not him," Jake said quietly. "It can't be him." I know, but my heart was pounding anyway. It's the same thing that was using Dr. Chen's voice. "Marcus, please. I don't want to die out here again." That last word hit me like a punch to the gut. Again, like he remembered dying the first time. Jake grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to it. Whatever it is, it's trying to get us away from the camp." He was right. I forced myself to stay put, to ignore my brother's voice calling from the darkness. After about 10 minutes, it stopped. But then, Dr. Chen started calling. Again. And after her, a voice I didn't recognize, probably one of the graduate students. They took turns throughout the night, calling for help, begging us to find them, leading us nowhere. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. Every time one of us started to doze off, the voices would start again. Closer this time, more urgent. As dawn broke, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Around the perimeter of our camp, just at the edge where our firelight faded into darkness, there were new tracks in the snow. Human tracks. Lots of them, all identical. Jake saw them too. "They're circling us," he said. The tracks formed a perfect ring around our shelter, maybe 30 feet out. But they were wrong, in the same way the tracks at Dr. Chen's camp had been wrong. Too deep, too uniform. Like they'd been made by the same person wearing the same boots, walking the same circuit over and over again. "How many times around?" I asked. Jake was studying the tracks, counting under his breath. 12 circuits, maybe 15. They were out there for hours. I thought about that. While we'd been sitting by our fire, listening to the voices call from the forest, something had been walking circles around us in the dark. Something that sounded human, but left tracks like no human should. "We need to get out of here," I said. But when I tried to start our camp stove to heat water for coffee, it wouldn't light. The fuel line had been cut clean through, like someone had taken a very sharp knife to it while we weren't looking. Same with our radio. The antenna cable had been severed, and the backup batteries were missing. And when Jake checked his pack for the emergency beacon, he found it empty except for a neat pile of small metal parts. Someone or something had taken it apart piece by piece and arranged the components in a perfect spiral pattern. "We're trapped," Jake said. "From somewhere in the forest, Doctor." Chen's voice called out, "Marcus! Jake, I found the others. Come quickly." But this time, her voice was coming from 3 different directions at once. We broke camp and started hiking south, toward the park road. Without GPS or radio, we were navigating by compass and dead reckoning. But it was better than staying put while whatever was out there played games with us. The voices followed us. Doctor, Chen, the graduate students. My dead brother Tommy, they called to us from the forest, always just out of sight, always trying to lead us off the trail. But Jake had found something that changed everything. "Look at this," he said during our midday rest. He was holding a piece of fabric, bright orange like the expedition gear Dr. Chen's team had been wearing. I took it from him. The fabric was torn and bloody, but that wasn't what made my hands shake. It was the bite marks. Human bite marks, with tears that suggested someone had been eating the fabric with desperate hunger. "Where did you find this?" "About 100 yards back. Hanging from a tree branch, 8 feet off the ground." I looked at the fabric again. The bite marks were too big. The tears too violent. Like someone with a mouth full of sharp teeth had been trying to eat through the material to get to whatever was underneath. "There's more," Jake said. He pulled out a small digital camera, the kind Dr. Chen's team would have used to document their research. The camera still worked. Jake scrolled through the photos on the little LCD screen. Geological samples, core drilling sites, the usual scientific documentation. But the last few photos were different. The first showed Dr. Chen and her 2 students around their campfire, smiling at the camera. Normal expedition photo. The second showed the same scene, but one of the students looked wrong. His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. The third photo was taken from inside a tent. Through the mesh door, you could see a figure standing by the fire. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its arms were wrong, too long, and ending in something that might have been claws. The fourth photo was just darkness. "When were these taken?" I asked. Jake checked the camera's timestamp. 3 days ago. The night before they were supposed to radio in. I thought about the voices we'd been hearing. Dr. Chen calling for help, the students begging us to find them. If these photos were real, then Dr. Chen and her team had been dead for 3 days. So what had been calling to us in their voices? That's when we heard the helicopter. It was coming from the south, the steady whop-whop-whop of rotor blades cutting through the cold air. Jake pulled out his signal mirror and started flashing it toward the sound. The helicopter found us 20 minutes later, setting down in a small clearing about half a mile from where we'd been hiking. The pilot was Bill Mackenzie, a guy I'd worked with dozens of times over the years. "Jesus, Marcus," he said as we climbed into the cabin. "We've been looking for you for 2 days. Your radio went dead yesterday morning." 2 days? Jake and I looked at each other. "Bill, we've been out here for 4 days." Bill shook his head. "You left the station 3 days ago. It's March 15th. But that was impossible. I'd been keeping track of the date, marking it in my notebook every morning. According to my records, it was March 18th. "We lost time," Jake said quietly. Bill started the helicopter, and we lifted off. But as we rose above the tree line, I looked down and saw something that made my blood freeze. In the snow below, spread across almost an acre of forest, was a pattern. Hundreds of human tracks, all identical, arranged in perfect spirals that covered the entire area where we'd been hiking. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what stood at the center of the spirals. It was tall, maybe 12 feet, and it stood on 2 legs like a human. But its proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, the head too large, and even from 200 feet up, I could see that its face was covered in dark fur. Otter fur. It was looking up at us with eyes that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. "You see that?" I asked Jake, pointing down at the figure. Jake looked where I was pointing. "See what?" The creature raised one massive arm and waved at us. A slow, deliberate gesture that somehow conveyed more menace than a threat. Then it opened its mouth. And even over the noise of the helicopter, I heard it speak in my brother's voice. "Goodbye, Marcus. See you again soon." Bill banked the helicopter toward home, and the creature disappeared behind the trees. But I knew it was still down there, waiting in the forest where the old miners had dug too deep into the earth, waiting for the next group of people who didn't believe in the old stories. The official report listed Dr. Chen and her team as victims of a bear attack with unusual circumstances. The Park Service found their bodies 2 weeks later, scattered across a half-mile area near the old mine shafts. What was left of them, anyway? Jake and I never talked about what we'd seen in the forest. What was the point? Who would believe us? But something changed in both of us after that week in the Kantishna Hills. Jake transferred to a desk job in Anchorage 3 months later, said he was tired of the wilderness, wanted to be closer to civilization. I didn't blame him. Some nights I still heard Dr. Chen calling for help in my dreams, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat wondering if the voices were coming from outside my window. I stayed on as a ranger for 2 more years, but I was never the same. Every search and rescue call made my hands shake. Every time someone went missing in the backcountry, I wondered if I'd find another neat arrangement of tracks with no footprints leading away. The worst part was the knowledge. My grandmother had tried to warn me, just like her grandmother had warned her. The old stories weren't just entertainment around the campfire, they were survival instructions, passed down from people who'd learned the hard way what lived in the wild places of Alaska. I finally quit the Park Service in 1989 and moved to Fairbanks, where I could see my neighbors' houses from my front yard, and the streetlights kept the darkness away. But even there, on the coldest winter nights when the temperature dropped below 40 and the aurora danced green and silver across the sky, I'd sometimes hear voices calling from the forest. Dr. Chen asking for help, the graduate students begging someone to find them. My brother Tommy telling me he was lost and scared. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear my own voice calling from out there in the dark, asking someone to come and save me from the thing that was pretending to be Marcus Thornfield. I never answered those voices. I'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. But I worry about the people who haven't learned it yet. The new rangers, the researchers, the tourists who think they understand Alaska because they've read a book or watched a documentary. They don't know about the old warnings, don't understand why the Athabascan elders still won't go near certain places when the winter nights are long and dark. They don't know about the Kushtaka, the shapeshifters that remember everything and forgive nothing. They don't know that some of the old gold miners never really left the Kantishna Hills. They just learned to wear different faces and speak with borrowed voices. And they're still hungry. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Alaska wilderness and you hear someone calling for help from the darkness, remember this story. Remember that voices can lie, that tracks can mislead, and that some things are better left alone in the places where they've always been. Because the next voice you hear calling from the forest might be your own. And if you answer it, you might find out what happened to the real you. My name is Diana Stormwright, and I've been a park ranger at Wrangell Street, Elias for 13 years. People think my job is all about checking permits and giving directions to tourists. They're wrong. Up here in Alaska's biggest national park, I deal with avalanches that can bury a house, ice storms that freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth, and rescues where one wrong step means you're never coming home. I'm what they call a high-altitude rescue specialist. That means when someone gets stuck on a mountain that's trying to kill them, they call me. I've pulled bodies out of crevasses so deep the sun never touches bottom. I've dug people out of snow slides with my bare hands. I've seen what happens when the mountain wins, but I never believed mountains could be haunted. Not until January of 1993, when I heard them sing. It started with a radio call on the 15th. 3 climbers had been attempting Mount Blackburn's north face. Not the smartest choice in the Neen, a middle of winter. But some people think they're tougher than a 16,000-foot peak in polar vortex conditions. The last anyone heard from them was 2 days earlier. Their message was strange. Do you hear that singing? It's beautiful. Tom Icefield, our helicopter pilot, shook his head when I showed him the weather reports. Winds hitting 90 miles per hour up there, Diana. That's not flying weather. We have to try, I said. 3 people are missing. Tom's been flying these mountains for 20 years. His face looks like carved leather, all lines and scars from dealing with Alaska weather. I'll get you close as I can to their last known position. But if this bird starts icing up, we're turning around. I loaded my gear: avalanche beacon, probe, shovel, first aid kit, emergency shelter. All the tools you need when the mountain decides to test you. I've used every piece of that equipment to save lives. Some days, it's not enough. The flight up to Mount Blackburn took 40 minutes through air so cold it hurt to breathe. Below us, the Klutlan Glacier stretched out like a frozen highway, all white and blue and deadly beautiful. That glacier has swallowed more people than I like to think about. There, Tom pointed through the windshield. That's where their GPS signal cut out. I looked down at the landing zone, a flat section of snow near the glacier's edge, surrounded by ice formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. The wind was making the helicopter shake like a leaf. "You sure about this?" Tom asked. "I'm sure." He set us down fast, just long enough for me to jump out with my pack. The rotor wash sent snow flying everywhere, stinging my face even through my goggles. Then, he was gone, leaving me alone on the mountain. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was barely there, just under the sound of the wind, like someone humming a lullaby, but far away. I stopped walking and listened, but the sound faded. I told myself it was just wind moving through the ice formations. Wind can make all sorts of strange noises up here. I found their base camp about a quarter-mile from the landing zone. 2 tents, properly staked down, food still in the bare canisters. Their climbing gear was laid out like they'd been planning their next day's route. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. Their rope was cut, not frayed or broken from a fall, cut clean through with something sharp. But that didn't make sense. Climbers don't cut their own rope unless something's gone very wrong. And if something had gone wrong, where were they? I followed their tracks up the glacier. The snow was wind-packed and hard, so the footprints were clear. 3 sets of boots, all heading toward the icefall, where the glacier tumbled down between 2 rock walls. Good climbing territory, but dangerous. One wrong step and you're in a crevasse that might go down 100 feet. The tracks led right to the edge of a big crevasse. I got down on my belly and looked over the side, shining my headlamp into the blue-green depths. Ice walls disappeared into darkness. No bodies, no gear, no sign of what happened to 3 experienced climbers. But there was something else. About 20 feet down, someone had carved words into the ice wall. The letters were big and deep, like they'd used an ice axe to cut them. But I couldn't read what they said. It wasn't English, wasn't any language I recognized. The wind picked up, howling through the ice formations around me, and underneath that howl, I heard the humming again. Clearer this time. It sounded like voices singing together, a harmony that made the hair on my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the wind. Mountains make strange noises. But as I packed up my gear and started back toward the pickup zone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from deep inside the glacier. Something that was singing. Tom picked me up just as the weather started turning really bad. The helicopter bucked and shook in the wind, and I could see ice forming on the rotors. "Find anything?" he shouted over the engine noise. "Their camp's intact, but they're gone. Rope was cut." And Tom, I hesitated. "There's something weird about that glacier." He gave me a look. Weird how? I almost told him about the singing, but stopped myself. Tom's a practical guy. He wouldn't understand about voices in the ice. Just a feeling. Back at the ranger station, I filed my report and tried to convince myself it was a normal search and rescue that just hadn't found anything yet. Mountains are good at hiding bodies. Sometimes people fall into crevasses so deep we never find them. Sometimes avalanches bury them so completely they don't show up until spring melt. But normal searches don't keep you awake at night, hearing phantom voices in the wind outside your cabin. 3 days later, another climbing team reported strange sounds coming from Mount Blackburn. Then a group of cross-country skiers said they'd heard singing near the Klutlan Glacier. That's when my supervisor, Chief Ranger Kate Morrison, called me into her office. "What's going on up there, Diana?" Kate's been running this park for 15 years. She's seen everything from bear attacks to avalanches that take out whole mountainsides. Nothing rattles her. "I don't know," I admitted, "but people are hearing things." "What kind of things?" I took a deep breath. Singing, voices that shouldn't be there. Kate frowned. You think there's someone else up there? Maybe squatters who don't want to be found? Maybe. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. What I'd heard wasn't human voices, it was something else. Take Tom and go back up. Do a full search of the glacier area. If there's someone hiding up there, we need to know about it. The next morning, we flew back to Mount Blackburn. The weather was better, but not by much. Tom set us down in the same spot, and this time he came with me. He brought his own climbing gear and a rifle, just in case we ran into bears. Where did you hear these voices? He asked as we hiked toward the glacier. I pointed toward the icefall. Over there, near where the missing climbers were last seen. We checked their abandoned camp first. Everything was still there, covered with 3 days of new snow. But something had changed. The cut rope was gone. All of it. Like someone had come back and cleaned up the evidence. That's strange, Tom said. Why would someone take damaged rope? I didn't have an answer. We kept walking toward the glacier, following the same route I'd taken before. The crevasse where I'd seen the carved words was still there, but when I looked down into it, the ice walls were smooth. No writing anywhere. You sure this is the right spot? Tom asked. I was sure. But the evidence was gone. Like someone had polished the ice clean, or like it had never been there at all. We split up to cover more ground. Tom went east along the glacier edge, while I headed west toward a series of ice caves that formed where the glacier met the rock wall. I'd explored those caves before, during other rescues. They went back about 50 feet before ending in solid ice. I was checking the third cave when I heard it again. The singing. Clear as anything, coming from deeper in the cave than should have been possible. Multiple voices harmonizing together, singing something that sounded almost like a lullaby. I turned on my headlamp and followed the sound. The cave should have ended after 50 feet, but it kept going. The walls were smooth ice, blue-green and beautiful, stretching ahead into darkness. I'd never seen this tunnel before. But ice formations can change fast in winter. The singing got louder as I went deeper. I could make out individual voices now. A woman's voice, high and sweet, a man's voice, deep and sad, and others layering underneath. The harmony was perfect, like a church choir. I rounded a corner and stopped. There, frozen into the ice wall, was a man's face. His eyes were closed like he was sleeping, and his mouth was open like he was singing. The ice around him was so clear I could see every detail. His beard, his climbing jacket, even the frost on his eyebrows. I knew that face. I'd seen it in the missing persons report. David Chen, one of the 3 climbers who'd disappeared. I stumbled backward and ran for the cave entrance, my heart hammering in my chest. When I got outside, Tom was waiting for me. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. Tom, we need to get out of here, right now. Why? What did you find? I was about to tell him when the singing started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the cave. It was coming from everywhere. The glacier, the mountain walls, even the snow under our feet. A dozen voices, then 20, then more than I could count, all singing the same haunting melody. Tom heard it too. His face went white. What the hell is that? The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 seconds. Our breath came out in huge clouds, and ice started forming on our gear. The singing got louder, and I could swear I heard words now, in a language that sounded old and cold and hungry. We're leaving, I said. Now. We ran for the helicopter, but the singing followed us. It was in the wind, in the ice under our feet, in the air we breathed. By the time we reached the landing zone, the helicopter rotors were covered in ice so thick Tom had to scrape them clean with his knife. I've never seen ice form that fast, he said, his hands shaking as he worked. It's like the whole mountain's trying to freeze us solid. We got in the air just as the storm hit. Wind and snow and ice so thick I couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. But as we flew away from Mount Blackburn, I could still hear the singing, faint but persistent, like a song that would never end. That night, I called David Chen's family to tell them I'd found him. But how do you tell someone their loved one is frozen in a glacier wall, singing with voices that shouldn't exist? I didn't make that call. Instead, I sat in my cabin and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But every time the wind picked up outside, I heard that melody again, calling me back to the mountain. I couldn't sleep for 3 nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David Chen's face in the ice. Peaceful and terrible at the same time. I kept thinking about his family, waiting for news, hoping he was alive somewhere, but I knew the truth now. He wasn't alive, but he wasn't exactly dead either. On the fourth night, Kate Morrison called me at 2 a.m. "Diana, we've got a problem. Another climbing team just sent out a distress signal from Mount Blackburn. Their message was," she paused. "Their message was, the singers want us to stay." I was already getting dressed. How many people? 4. Experienced climbers from Anchorage. They were supposed to check in 6 hours ago. Tom met me at the helicopter pad, his face grim. "Weather's marginal, but flyable. You sure you want to go back up there?" I thought about those 4 climbers, maybe already frozen into the ice wall, adding their voices to whatever was singing in the glacier. I'm sure. The flight took longer this time because of ice storms moving through the area. When we finally reached Mount Blackburn, the whole mountain looked different. The snow was arranged in patterns that didn't make sense, perfect spirals and geometric shapes that no natural wind could create. It looked like someone had been drawing on the mountainside. We found the climbers' camp, but it was wrong. Their tents were arranged in a perfect circle around a fire that was still burning, even though it should have been buried under hours of snowfall. The flames were blue-white instead of orange, and they didn't give off any heat. "That's not normal," Tom said, stating the obvious. I approached the camp carefully, my avalanche beacon beeping steadily. But it wasn't picking up avalanche signals. It was detecting something else, electronic signatures coming from deep underground, deeper than any avalanche beacon should be able to reach. The climbers were nowhere to be found, but their gear was all there. Sleeping bags still warm, food half-eaten, climbing ropes coiled neatly beside each tent, like they'd just stood up and walked away in the middle of whatever they were doing. I checked my beacon again. 4 signals, coming from directly below the campsite. But that was impossible. The signals were showing up at a depth of over 200 feet, right in the middle of solid glacier ice. "Tom," I called, "come look at this." He came over and looked at my beacon display. His face went pale. "Those are the missing climbers from last week?" I shook my head. "These are new signals, from today." The singing started then, just like before. But this time it was louder, more urgent. 8 voices instead of 4, harmonizing in that strange language that made my teeth ache. And underneath the melody, I could hear something else. Words in English, faint but clear. "Join us," they sang. "It's warm down here. It's safe. Join us in the ice." Tom grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Right now." But as we turned toward the helicopter, the snow around us started moving. Not blowing in the wind, moving on purpose, forming itself into shapes. First letters, then words, then complete sentences in that same unknown language I'd seen carved in the crevasse. The temperature dropped again, faster than before. Ice formed on our clothes, our gear, our exposed skin. The helicopter's engine started making a grinding sound as ice built up in the rotors. "The engine's going to freeze," Tom shouted over the singing. "If we don't leave in the next minute, we're not leaving at all." I looked back at the camp, at the blue fire that shouldn't exist, and the perfect spiral patterns in the snow. 4 more people were down there in the ice, singing with the others, adding their voices to whatever was growing under Mount Blackburn. We ran for the helicopter, but the snow was getting deeper with every step. Not falling snow, snow that was rising up from the ground, like the glacier was trying to swallow us. I could feel it grabbing at my boots, trying to pull me down. Tom got the engine started just as the singing reached a crescendo. All 8 voices together now, so loud it felt like the sound was coming from inside my skull. The helicopter lifted off, but barely. Ice was forming on everything, weighing us down. "I can't get altitude," Tom yelled. "Too much ice on the rotors." We were flying just 20 feet above the glacier, struggling to stay airborne. Below us, I could see more shapes in the snow. Human figures made of ice and wind, reaching up toward our helicopter with frozen hands. Then, I saw them. The missing climbers, all 8 of them, standing in a line on the glacier surface. They were translucent, like they were made of ice themselves, but I could see their faces clearly. David Chen was there, and the 4 climbers from Anchorage. They were all singing, their mouths open, their eyes fixed on our struggling helicopter. And they weren't alone. Behind them stood dozens of other figures, some in modern climbing gear, others in clothes from decades past. All of them singing, all of them reaching toward us with frozen hands. There, Tom pointed ahead. Open ground. He brought us down hard on a section of bare rock, the helicopter skidding across ice-covered granite. We sat there for 10 minutes, letting the engine warm up and melt the ice off the rotors, while the singing slowly faded behind us. "How many people do you think are up there?" Tom asked quietly. I thought about the figures I'd seen, the voices in the harmony. Too many. Way too many. When we got back to the station, I pulled the files on every missing person case in the Mount Blackburn area for the last 20 years. Climbers, hikers, cross-country skiers. 43 people who'd gone missing and never been found. 43 voices that might be singing in the ice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I dug deeper into the records. Mount Blackburn wasn't just a mountain where people got lost. It was the site of the biggest unsolved mystery in Alaska aviation history. In 1971, a passenger plane with 23 people on board had disappeared in a storm near Mount Blackburn. The wreckage was never found. The passengers were never recovered. But according to the old reports, search teams had reported hearing singing voices coming from the glacier for weeks after the crash. 23 voices, plus 20 years of missing climbers and hikers. I was starting to understand what we were dealing with, and I was starting to realize that the mountain wasn't just taking people, it was collecting them. I spent the next 2 days reading everything I could find about the 1971 crash. Flight 447, a small passenger plane flying from Fairbanks to Anchorage, had disappeared during a blizzard on December 15th. The pilot had radioed that they were flying through severe turbulence near Mount Blackburn. Then, nothing. No distress signal, no emergency beacon, no wreckage ever found. But the really interesting part was in the search reports. For 3 weeks after the crash, multiple search teams reported hearing coordinated singing voices coming from the Klutlan Glacier area. The official report dismissed it as acoustic phenomena caused by wind through ice formations. But I was starting to think the official report was wrong. I also found something else that made my blood run cold. According to Tlingit tribal records, Mount Blackburn was considered a sacred site, specifically a place where the spirits of people who died in the cold were supposed to find rest. But the records also included warnings about what happened when too many spirits gathered in one place. They called it the hungry singing, voices that called to the living, trying to add them to the choir of the dead. On the 6th day, Kate Morrison called me into her office again. "Diana, we've got a situation. A family from Anchorage is demanding we mount a full search operation for their daughter. She was one of the 4 climbers who went missing. We already searched. There's nothing to find." Kate looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "There are 4 people missing on that mountain. We can't just write them off." "Kate, you don't understand what's up there." "Then explain it to me." I took a deep breath. "There's something in the glacier, something that's been collecting people for 50 years. The missing climbers aren't lost, they're part of it now." Kate was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Diana, I think you need to take some time off. You've been under a lot of stress." "This isn't stress, this is real. There are voices in the ice, and they're trying to..." "Diana." Kate's voice was firm. "You're off active duty until you've talked to someone. A counselor, a doctor, someone who can help you work through whatever's happening here." I left her office knowing I was on my own. Nobody was going to believe me until it was too late. And every day we waited, more people might disappear into the ice. That night, I got a call from my father. He'd been the chief ranger back in 1971, when Flight 447 disappeared. He'd led the search operation himself. "Katie Morrison called me," he said. "She's worried about you. Says you think there's something supernatural on Mount Blackburn." "Dad, you searched for that plane. Did you ever find anything?" There was a long pause. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think the passengers from Flight 447 are still up there. I think they've been collecting other people who get too close. I think..." "Diana," his voice was sharp, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Some things are better left alone. Some places are meant to be avoided. Do you understand? Dad, what did you find up there?" Another pause. "We found the plane on December 20th, 5 days after it crashed. The fuselage was cracked open like an egg, buried in a crevasse about 300 feet deep. But the passengers, Diana, we found them arranged in a circle around the wreckage. All 23 of them, sitting in the snow like they were having a meeting, frozen solid, but their eyes were open. And they were all facing the center of the circle. I felt cold fingers walking up my spine. What was in the bod? Center? Nothing, just snow. But it was the wrong kind of snow. It was moving, swirling around in patterns, even though there wasn't any wind down in that crevasse. And the whole time we were down there, we could hear singing, faint but clear, like the passengers were humming together. What did you do? What any sane person would do. We got out of there and marked the area as permanently inaccessible due to unstable ice conditions. Then we filed a report saying we never found the wreckage. I understood now. The spirits from Flight 447 had been waiting in the ice for 50 years, growing stronger, learning how to call to the living. Every missing climber, every lost hiker, had made them more powerful. Dad, there are people up there right now. 8 people who are trapped in the ice, singing with the others. If I don't do something, Diana, no. You stay away from that mountain. Some things can't be fixed. But I was already making plans. I knew where the plane was now. I knew where the spirits were strongest. And I had an idea about how to stop them. I just wasn't sure I'd survive trying. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I loaded my pack with everything I'd need for a solo climb. Rope, ice axes, crampons, emergency shelter, but I also packed something else, a book of Tlingit funeral chants I'd borrowed from the Tribal Cultural Center. If the spirits were trapped because they'd never been properly laid to rest, maybe the right words could set them free. At dawn, I drove to the helicopter pad. Tom was already there, checking the weather reports. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. "Mount Blackburn. One last time." "Not without me, you're not." He started pre-flight checks on the helicopter. Kate Morrison called. Said you were off active duty, but she didn't say anything about me. 30 minutes later, we were flying toward Mount Blackburn through clear morning air. The mountain looked peaceful. From a distance, just snow and ice and rock reaching toward a blue sky. But I knew better now. I knew what was waiting beneath the surface. "Where exactly are we going?" Tom asked. I checked the coordinates from my father's old search report. The crash site, 300 feet down in the Klutlan Glacier. Tom looked at me sideways. "You know where Flight 447 crashed?" My dad found it in 1971. He never reported it because of what he found there. We landed near the glacier, and I started rigging rope for a descent into the crevasse. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for one person, but it went down into blue-black darkness. I could already hear the singing, faint but growing stronger. "You sure about this?" Tom asked. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." I rappelled down into the ice, following the beam of my headlamp into the depths of the glacier. The walls were smooth and blue-green, like being inside a frozen cathedral. The singing got louder as I descended, until it was all around me, coming from the ice itself. At 250 feet, I found them. The passengers from Flight 447 were still sitting in their circle, just like my father had described. But they weren't just frozen anymore. They were part of the ice itself, their bodies translucent and glowing with cold blue light. Their mouths were open, and they were singing in perfect harmony. And they weren't alone. The 8 missing climbers were there too, sitting in a second circle inside the first one. Their eyes were closed, and they were singing the same haunting melody. They looked peaceful, almost happy. In the center of both circles was the twisted wreckage of Flight 447, covered in ice that moved and swirled like liquid. And rising from the wreckage was something that might have been human once, but wasn't anymore. It was tall and thin, made of ice and wind and hungry cold. Its face was a collection of features from all the people it had collected, constantly shifting and changing. It looked at me with eyes like frozen stars and spoke in a voice that was all the singers combined. "Diana Stormwright, we've been waiting for you. Your father promised us you would come." The spirit thing that used to be 23 passengers and 8 climbers stood in the center of its frozen circle, waiting for my answer. Its voice was like wind through ice caves, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "We're not evil," it said. "We're just cold, so very cold. And lonely. But when people join us, they're warm forever. They never have to face the mountain alone again. I understood now. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to save people from the same fate they'd suffered, dying alone in the cold. But they didn't understand that pulling people into the ice wasn't saving them. It was just spreading the curse. I opened the book of Tlingit funeral chants and started reading. The words were in a language I didn't speak, but somehow I knew what they meant. They were prayers for the spirits of people who died in the wilderness, words to help them find peace and move on to whatever came next. The singing stopped. The spirit looked at me with surprise, its shifting features settling into something almost human. "You're not here to join us?" "I'm here to help you leave," I said, continuing to read. "You've been trapped here for 50 years. It's time to let go." The ice around the wreckage started cracking. Deep groans echoed through the crevasse as the glacier shifted and settled. The spirit's form began to waver, becoming less solid. "But we'll be alone?" it whispered. "Cold and alone." "No," I said, "you'll be free." I kept reading the funeral chants, and one by one, the singers began to fade. The passengers from Flight 447 first, their ice forms dissolving into mist that rose up toward the surface. Then the climbers, their peaceful faces smiling as they disappeared. The spirit in the center was the last to go. As it faded, it looked at me one final time. "Thank you," it said. We'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm. Then it was gone, and I was alone in the crevasse with nothing but broken metal and ordinary ice. I climbed back up to find Tom pacing nervously at the edge of the crevasse. "What happened down there?" he asked. I heard the singing stop. "It's over," I said. "They're at peace now." We flew back to the station in silence. I filed a report that said I'd found evidence of the Flight 447 crash site and that the area should be properly marked and documented. I didn't mention the spirits or the singing or the funeral chants. Some things are too big for official reports. Kate Morrison took me off suspension after I passed a psychological evaluation. The doctor said I was suffering from stress-related auditory hallucinations, which was easier than trying to explain the truth. But the truth was, in the results, no one else has gone missing near Mount Blackburn. The rescue calls stopped coming. The mountain is quiet now, just wind and snow and ice, the way mountains are supposed to be. Sometimes, on clear nights when the wind is blowing from the north, I think I can hear something faint and far away. Not singing this time, but something else. Laughter, maybe. The sound of people who have finally found peace. I still work search and rescue in Wrangell Street, Elias. I still pull people out of crevasses and dig them out of avalanches. But I know now that mountains aren't just rock and ice. They're places where the boundary between the living and the dead gets thin, where spirits can linger if they have unfinished business. My job isn't just about saving the living anymore. Sometimes it's about helping the dead find their way home. And sometimes, late at night in my cabin, when the wind is howling through the peaks and the temperature drops below zero, I remember what that spirit told me about being cold and alone. I understand why they tried to collect people, why they thought trapping souls in ice was an act of kindness. Because up here in Alaska, in the highest and loneliest places on Earth, the cold isn't just weather. It's a living thing that gets into your bones and your heart and your soul. And the only thing worse than dying in the cold is dying in the cold alone. But I also learned something else that night in the glacier. Sometimes the best way to help someone isn't to keep them with you forever. Sometimes it's to give them permission to let go. The spirits of Flight 447 taught me that. They also taught me that even the dead can learn to be warm again, if someone cares enough to show them the way. Mount Blackburn stands quiet now, its peaks white against the blue Alaska sky. But I know it's not empty. Nothing in Alaska is ever really empty. The wilderness is full of stories, full of spirits, full of people who came looking for something and found more than they bargained for. I'm one of those people now. And every day I go out into the mountains, I carry their stories with me. A reminder that some rescues take more than rope and determination. Some rescues take understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to face things that shouldn't exist but do anyway. That's what it means to be a ranger in Alaska. You don't just protect people from the wilderness, you protect the wilderness from people. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, you help both sides find peace. The mountain remembers everything, and now, So do I. My name is Robert Deepwater, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier Bay for 21 years. Before that, I spent time in the Coast Guard. My grandfather was Tlingit, and he used to tell stories about sea monsters when I was little. Back then, I thought they were just stories to scare kids. I wish I still believed that. It was August 1989, and something was wrong with the water. I'd been patrolling Muir Inlet for 2 decades, and I knew these fjords better than my own backyard. The water was warmer than usual, glacier ice melting faster than I'd ever seen. Old ice, the kind that had been frozen for thousands of years, was breaking apart and floating out to sea. That morning, I was checking my boat at the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. Ranger station, this is Dr. Sarah Chen, on the research vessel Times Northern Light *. We're getting some weird sonar readings out here. I grabbed the radio. This is Ranger Deepwater. What kind of readings, Dr. Chen? Something big moving under us. Really big, but it's moving too fast to be a whale. I frowned. Whales were common in these waters, but they had their patterns. What's your location? About 2 miles into Muir Inlet, near the deepest channel. That was 300 feet of water. Deep enough to hide almost anything. I'll head out to check on you, I told her. Keep your radio on. 20 minutes later, I was cutting through the calm water in my patrol boat. The silence hit me first. No seabirds calling, no splash of seals. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. In 21 years, I'd never heard Glacier Bay this quiet. I tried raising the Times Northern Light Times on the radio. Nothing but static. Then I saw the oil slick. It spread across the water like a dark rainbow, maybe 50 yards wide. But it wasn't oil. It was too thick, too red. I cut my engine and drifted closer. The smell hit me like a punch in the face. Blood, gallons and gallons of blood, mixing with seawater. Dead fish floated in the mess, but they weren't scattered randomly. They formed a perfect spiral pattern, like something had stirred the water in a giant circle. I grabbed my radio and tried the Coast Guard. Coast Guard Station Juneau. This is Ranger Deepwater at Glacier Bay. I need immediate assistance at Muir Inlet. Research vessel may be in distress. The radio squawked back at me, but the words were broken up by static. The mountains around the inlet created radio shadows, but I'd never had interference this bad. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the water. No sign of the Times Northern Light *, but about 100 yards away, something white bobbed in the waves. I motored over carefully, trying not to disturb the blood slick more than necessary. It was a piece of fiberglass. Part of a boat's hull, maybe 3 feet across. But what made my stomach drop weren't the jagged edges where it had broken away from the main boat. It was the marks along one side, deep gouges that looked almost like bite marks, but they were huge, each one the size of my fist. I'd seen what orca teeth could do to a small boat, but these marks were different, bigger, more of them, and they went deeper than any whale bite I'd ever seen. I took photos and collected the piece as evidence. The whole time, I felt like something was watching me from underwater. Stupid, I told myself, just nerves from finding the wreckage. But when I looked down into the dark water, I could swear I saw lights moving way down deep, probably just sunlight playing tricks through the blood and oil. I spent another hour searching, but found no other trace of Dr. Chen or her boat. The Coast Guard would have to send a dive team. I turned my boat toward shore, but kept looking back at that spiral of dead fish. My grandfather had told me that when the old ice melted, things that had been sleeping would wake up. Things that were better left alone. Just stories, I said, out loud, but my voice sounded small over the water. As I headed back to the station, I didn't notice the massive shadow that passed under my boat, following me toward shore. The Coast Guard dive team arrived the next morning, along with Dr. Luna Seaview, a marine biologist from the University of Alaska. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of intense focus that told me she took her work seriously. I knew Sarah Chen, she told me as we loaded gear onto my patrol boat. We studied together. She was one of the best marine researchers in Alaska. Whatever happened to her boat, it wasn't pilot error. I liked Dr. Seaview immediately. Too many university types talked down to us rangers, but she treated me like a partner. "Call me Luna," she said as we headed back out to the inlet. The water looked different in daylight, cleaner. The blood slick was gone, but the smell still lingered in the air. Luna had brought underwater cameras and specialized sonar equipment. The readings Sarah mentioned before she disappeared, Luna explained, checking her instruments. She said something was moving at 40 knots underwater. That's impossible for any known marine animal. Maybe it was equipment malfunction? Maybe. But look at this. She showed me her sonar screen. At the very edge, something huge was moving along the bottom of the inlet. That signature is bigger than a blue whale, but it's moving like a dolphin. We anchored over the deepest part of the channel, and Luna lowered her cameras. For 20 minutes, we watched the screens showing nothing but murky water and the occasional fish. Then the lights appeared. At first, I thought it was just the camera's illumination reflecting off something metallic. But these lights were moving in patterns, lines and circles that pulsed like a heartbeat. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Luna was leaning forward, staring at the screen. "I don't know. But it's responding to the camera light." The lights on the screen began to pulse faster, brighter. Then they started moving upward. "It's coming up," Luna said. "Pull up the camera." I started cranking the winch as fast as I could, but whatever was down there was moving faster. The lights grew bigger and brighter on the screen. I could see they weren't reflecting light, they were making their own. Suddenly, something slammed into the bottom of our boat. The impact threw us both to the deck. My radio flew overboard, and Luna's equipment sparked and went dead. We lay there for a moment, listening to the water lap against the hull. "Engine," I said quietly. "Now." But when I tried to start the motor, nothing happened. I pulled the emergency cord, still nothing. Whatever had hit us had damaged something important. That's when we heard the sound. It came from underneath the boat, a low rumbling that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. Like a whale song, but deeper, angrier. The water around us began to glow with the same pulsing light we'd seen on the camera. "Robert," Luna whispered, pointing over the side. I looked down into water that was now bright as daylight, and I saw it. It was huge, maybe 80 feet long, moving in the water like a giant snake. Its skin was dark blue-green, covered in patterns of light that ran along its sides like racing stripes. The head was the worst part, shaped like a wolf's skull but big as a car, with rows and rows of teeth that glowed white in the bioluminescent display. "Gona Cadet," I breathed, remembering my grandfather's stories. The creature circled our boat once, twice. Each time it passed underneath, the boat rocked from the displaced water. Those lights along its sides were hypnotic, pulsing in rhythm with some ancient heartbeat. Then it stopped directly below us and began to rise. The water around our boat started to churn. I grabbed Luna's arm and pulled her to the center of the boat as the creature's massive head broke the surface. Two eyes the size of dinner plates stared at us. Intelligence burned in those eyes, not the simple awareness of a whale or shark, but something that could think, that could plan, something that knew exactly what we were. The creature opened its mouth, and I saw why the bite marks on that piece of fiberglass had been so huge. Rows of teeth spiraled back into its throat like the inside of a blender. It could have eaten our 20-foot boat in 2 bites. Instead, it just watched us with those terrible eyes, studying us, learning about us. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it slipped back under the water. The lights faded, and we were left floating in normal daylight again. Luna was shaking. Did that really just happen? I was already checking our emergency supplies. Flares, emergency radio, life jackets. We need to get out of here, now. I tried the engine again. This time it coughed to life, but it was running rough. Something was definitely damaged. As we limped back toward the ranger station, I kept looking over my shoulder at the water behind us, but all I saw were the normal ripples of our wake. It wasn't until we were almost ashore that I realized what was bothering me. The creature had been studying us, yes, but it had also been playing with us. Like a cat plays with a mouse before it kills it. "Nobody's going to believe this," Luna said as we sat in the ranger station that evening. She'd been trying to salvage data from her damaged equipment, while I filed reports and tried to reach the Coast Guard on the backup radio. "My grandfather would have believed it," I said. "He told me stories about Gona Cadet when I was a kid. Said it was a sea spirit that could control the tides and the weather. I always thought it was just folklore." Maybe your grandfather knew more than you thought. The radio finally crackled to life. Coast Guard Station. Juneau was sending another dive team in the morning, along with a full search and rescue operation. I didn't tell them what we'd really seen. How could I? That night, I barely slept. Every time I dozed off, I dreamed about those glowing eyes watching me from dark water. The next morning brought fog so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The Coast Guard postponed their dive operation, but Luna insisted we go back out. We need more evidence, she said. Something concrete we can show people. Against my better judgment, I agreed. This time we brought backup equipment and stayed closer to shore. We anchored in about 60 feet of water near the inlet's mouth. Luna lowered a different kind of camera, one designed to work in low visibility. For an hour, we saw nothing but gray murk and the occasional salmon. Then the salmon started swimming in circles. At first it was just a few fish, swimming in tight loops like they were confused. But more and more joined them, until hundreds of salmon were spinning in a massive spiral directly below our boat. "They're being herded," Luna said, staring at the screen in amazement. "Something's controlling them." The water beneath us began to glow again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed the emergency radio and tried to call for help, but all I got was static. The creature's bioluminescence was interfering with our electronics, just like before. "Look," Luna whispered. Through the swirling mass of salmon, we could see the creature rising toward us. But it wasn't alone this time. Two smaller shapes flanked it, maybe 40 feet long each, with the same wolf-like heads and glowing patterns. "A family," I said. "Or a pack." The largest creature broke the surface first, sending waves that rocked our boat. The two smaller ones followed, positioning themselves on either side of us. We were surrounded. The big one, the one I'd started thinking of as the alpha, studied us, again with those intelligent eyes. But this time, something was different. The lights along its sides weren't pulsing randomly. They were forming patterns, almost like, "It's trying to communicate," Luna said. The creature's bioluminescent display shifted and changed, creating complex geometric patterns along its flanks. Lines and circles, spirals and stars. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place what. Then I remembered my grandfather's stories. He'd drawn symbols in the sand when he told them. Tlingit pictographs that represented the sea spirits. The patterns on the creature's sides were almost identical. "It knows the old language," I whispered. The alpha creature's display suddenly changed. The patterns became angry, aggressive, reds and oranges instead of blues and greens. The water around us began to heat up. I could feel it through the hull of the boat. "I think we overstayed our welcome," Luna said. The creature opened its mouth and let out that bone-deep roar again. But this time, the two smaller ones answered. The harmony was terrifying, like whale song mixed with a freight train. Then they began to circle us. The alpha went one way, the other two went the opposite direction. They moved faster and faster, creating a whirlpool around our boat. The water level rose as they spun, lifting us higher and higher. "Hold on," I shouted, but it was too late. The creature suddenly dove, and all that displaced water came crashing back down. Our boat flipped like a toy in a bathtub. The cold water hit me like a punch to the chest. I surfaced, gasping, and looked around for Luna. She was about 20 feet away, clinging to a piece of our boat's canopy. "Luna, this way." I started swimming toward her. But the water beneath me suddenly lit up. One of the smaller creatures was rising directly below Luna. "Swim," I yelled. "Swim toward shore." But it was too late. The creature's massive head broke, the surface right next to her. Luna screamed and tried to swim away, but those jaws opened wide. I saw the blood spray across the water before Luna's scream cut off. The creature didn't surface again. It had taken her down to the depths. I floated there in my life jacket, alone in the fog, surrounded by the scattered wreckage of my boat. The water around me still glowed faintly, and I knew they were down there, watching me, waiting. I started swimming toward shore, moving as quietly as I could. Every few strokes, I felt something brush against my legs in the water, testing me, playing with me. It took me 2 hours to reach land, and I felt those eyes on me the entire time. I made it to shore near White Thunder Ridge, about 3 miles from the ranger station. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work my emergency radio. "Mayday, mayday." This is Ranger Deepwater. I need immediate assistance. Dr. Seaview is dead. The static cleared. For a moment. Ranger Deepwater, this is Coast Guard Station Juneau. Please repeat your last transmission. My boat capsized in Muir Inlet. Marine biologist Luna Seaview was killed by. I stopped. How could I tell them the truth? Killed by what, Ranger Deepwater? By a large marine animal, possible orca attack. I need immediate rescue and recovery operation. It was a lie, but it was a lie they could accept. By evening, the Coast Guard had pulled me out and begun searching for Luna's body. They found pieces of my boat scattered across a 2-mile area, but no sign of what had caused the accident. I spent 3 days in the hospital in Juneau, getting treated for hypothermia and shock. The official report listed Luna's death as a marine accident, probable orca attack during equipment malfunction. Case closed. But I knew the truth, and I knew it wasn't over. When I got back to Glacier Bay, I went to see Tommy Kahat, an elder from the local Tlingit community. He was my grandfather's cousin, one of the few people left who still knew the old stories. Gonakadet, he said, when I finished telling him what had happened. My grandfather's grandfather saw one, back when the Russians first came to these waters. Many ships were lost. How do you stop it? Tommy looked out at the water for a long time before answering. You don't stop Gonakadet. It is older than the ice, older than the land, but there are ways to negotiate. He told me about the old rituals, the offerings that could sometimes appease the sea spirit, salmon, carved jade, human blood. But the most important thing was respect. Gonakadet punishes those who take too much from the sea, Tommy said. The warming waters have awakened it from deep sleep. It sees the boats, the fishing, the research. It thinks humans are taking more than they should. 2 weeks later, I was back on patrol. The Park Service had given me a new boat and orders to stay away from the deep water of Muir Inlet. But I couldn't leave it alone. Every night, I dreamed about those intelligent eyes watching me from the depths. On my last official patrol of the season, I made a decision. I loaded my boat with fresh salmon from the fish market in Gustavus, along with a piece of jade that had belonged to my grandfather. If Tommy was right, maybe I could reach some kind of understanding with the creature. I motored out to the deepest part of Muir Inlet as the sun was setting. The water was calm, reflecting the pink and orange sky like a mirror. I cut the engine and let the boat drift. Gonakadet, I called out over the water, feeling foolish but desperate. I bring gifts. I started throwing salmon overboard, one at a time. The fish sank into the dark water and disappeared. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the water began to glow. The alpha creature rose from the depths slowly, its bioluminescent patterns calm and steady. It floated near the surface, about 50 feet away, watching me with those massive eyes. I held up the piece of jade, a carved killer whale that my grandfather had worn around his neck. This belonged to someone who respected the old ways. I said, someone who understood that the sea has its own laws. I threw the jade into the water. The creature dove and retrieved it in its massive jaws, then surfaced again. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the darkening water. Then the creature's bioluminescent patterns shifted to the blues and greens I'd seen before. Calm colors. Peaceful colors. It gave one low, rumbling call, not the angry roar from before, but something that sounded almost like acknowledgement. Then it sank back into the depths, and the water returned to normal. I sat there in my boat for another hour, but the creature didn't return. That was 35 years ago. I retired from the Park Service in 2003, but I still live here in Gustavus. Still keep an eye on the water. The official records list Luna Seaview's death as a marine accident. Dr. Sarah Chen was declared lost at sea. Her research vessel never found. The Coast Guard installed better radio equipment in the area and updated their safety protocols. Life went on. But I know the truth. Gonakadet is still out there in the deep waters of Glacier Bay. I've seen the lights in Muir Inlet on foggy nights, and local fishermen sometimes report sonar readings that don't make sense. The Park Service tells visitors to stay in the shallow areas, especially during the salmon runs. Climate change has been hard on Glacier Bay. The old ice is melting faster every year, and the water temperatures keep rising. Sometimes I wonder what else might wake up as those ancient glaciers disappear. Young people today don't believe in sea monsters. They think everything can be explained by science, measured and catalogued and understood. But my grandfather's people knew better. They knew that the sea has its own spirits, its own laws. Every summer, I take my small boat out to the inlet and leave offerings, salmon, sometimes other things. The jade my grandfather wore is somewhere on the bottom of Muir Inlet now, but I think it served its purpose. The creature and I have an understanding. It stays in the deep water, and I make sure people respect its territory. Most of the time, anyway. Last month, a research vessel from Seattle got too close to the deepest channel. Their sonar equipment stopped working, and they reported massive electrical interference before limping back to port with a damaged hull. The captain swore something had rammed them from below, but the Coast Guard found no evidence of collision with a reef or another vessel. I could have told them what really happened, but who would believe an old retired ranger talking about sea monsters? Some secrets are meant to stay in the deep places. Some truths are too big for the world, above water. But if you ever find yourself in Glacier Bay, remember what my grandfather taught me. The sea has its own rules, older than any human law. Respect those rules, and the sea might let you pass safely. Ignore them, and you might find yourself face to face with something that was old when the glaciers were young. Something that glows in the dark water and remembers every slight, every transgression against its ancient domain. Something that's still down there, waiting in the blood-dark tides of Glacier Bay. My name is Robert Deepwater, and that's my story. Believe it or don't, the creature doesn't care either way. But if you don't believe me, just remember this. There are still places in this world where science ends and mystery begins. Glacier Bay is one of them. And Gonikadet is still hungry. My name is Patricia Moonhunter, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. People always ask me about the name. My grandmother picked it when I was born. She said I had eyes that could see in the dark, like someone who hunts under the moon. I thought it was just a pretty story until November 1994, when I learned there are things in the darkness that hunt back. I work at Kobuk Valley National Park in Alaska. It's not like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. Most people never heard of it. We have 25 square miles of sand dunes sitting 160 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Sounds crazy, right? Sand dunes in Alaska. But they're real, and they're ancient. I'm not just a regular ranger. I studied archaeology before I took this job. My specialty is protecting the old sites where the Inupiat people lived and hunted for thousands of years. My grandmother was Inupiat. She told me stories about the old days, about spirits that protected sacred places. I always thought they were just stories. The dunes are beautiful and scary at the same time. In summer, they look like gold under the midnight sun. In winter, they turn white and cold, like frozen waves in an endless ocean. November is when the polar night begins. The sun disappears for months. Temperature drops to 30 below zero. The nearest town is 90 miles away. If something goes wrong, you're on your own. I was alone at the ranger station when the call came in. Dr. Sarah Chen, an archaeology professor from the University of Alaska, had been camping near Onion Portage with 3 graduate students. Onion Portage is special. It's where people lived and hunted for over 10,000 years. We found tools and bones that are older than the pyramids. Dr. Chen was supposed to radio in every day at 6 p.m. She missed 2 days in a row. That wasn't like her. She was careful, professional. She knew the rules. I tried calling on the satellite phone. Nothing, just static. The weather was getting worse. A big storm was coming from the north. If I was going to find them, I had to go now. I loaded my snowmobile with emergency supplies. Extra food, medical kit, sleeping bag, rated for 50 below, flare gun, and my rifle. In the Arctic, you never know what you might meet. Polar bears, wolves, or worse, the cold itself trying to kill you. The ride to Onion Portage took 3 hours through blowing snow. My headlight cut through the darkness like a knife. Everything was white and black. No colors, no life, just me and the machine and the endless frozen desert. I found their camp just before midnight. It looked wrong from a distance. The tents were still standing, but something felt off. No tracks in the snow leading away. No signs they had packed up and left. The camp looked abandoned, but not empty. I cut the engine and listened. The silence in the Arctic is not like silence anywhere else. It's so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. But this was different. This silence felt heavy, like something big was holding its breath. I called out, "Dr. Chen? Sarah? It's Patricia from the Park Service." My voice disappeared into the darkness. No echo. No answer. I walked into the camp with my flashlight ready. The first tent was Dr. Chen's. I unzipped the door and looked inside. Her sleeping bag was there. Her research notes were scattered on a small table. A cup of coffee sat next to her laptop, frozen solid. But no Dr. Chen. I checked the other tents. Same thing. Sleeping bags, personal items, research equipment. But no people. It was like they had just vanished into the air. Then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Wolf tracks in the snow. But these weren't normal wolf tracks. They were huge, 8 inches across. I've seen plenty of wolf prints in my time as a ranger. The biggest ones are maybe 5 inches. These were different. Deeper too, like whatever made them was much heavier than any wolf should be. I followed the tracks with my flashlight. They led from the camp toward the dunes. But wolves don't live in sand dunes. They stay in the forests where there are caribou and small animals to hunt. The dunes are empty. Nothing lives there except some hardy plants and insects. The tracks disappeared at the edge of the dunes, swallowed by the shifting sand and snow. I was starting to feel scared, but I pushed it down. I'm a professional. I'm trained for this. People don't just disappear. There had to be a reasonable explanation. That's when I heard it for the first time. A howl, long and deep, coming from somewhere out in the dunes. But it wasn't like any wolf howl I'd ever heard. It was bigger somehow, sadder, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I stood frozen in the camp, listening to that howl fade away into the darkness. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. In all my years in Alaska, I'd never heard anything like it. I forced myself to think like a ranger, not like a scared person. Dr. Chen and her students were missing. That was my job, to find missing people and bring them home safe. Whatever was making that sound, I could handle it. I went back to my snowmobile and grabbed my satellite phone. Still no signal. The GPS was acting strange too. It kept showing my location as somewhere else, jumping around like it couldn't figure out where I was. Electronics can be weird in the Arctic. Cold batteries, magnetic fields from the aurora, permafrost affecting signals. I had backup equipment and knew how to navigate by the stars. I wasn't lost. I decided to set up my own camp right there and search the area in daylight. Well, not real daylight. In November, we get a few hours of gray twilight around noon, but mostly it's just different shades of dark. As I was setting up my tent, I found something that made me stop cold. There were more tracks around the camp. Not just the huge wolf prints, human footprints too, but they were wrong somehow. They started normal, leading away from Dr. Chen's tent. But about 20 feet out, they got weird. Longer strides, like whoever was walking suddenly started taking steps twice as long as normal. And they were deep, too deep, like the person suddenly got much heavier. The human tracks mixed with the wolf tracks. Then they all disappeared together at the dunes. I tried to stay calm. Maybe one of the students was injured and Dr. Chen was helping them. Maybe they were heading for the research station 5 miles south. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. But normal explanations don't make people take 8-foot steps. I finished setting up camp and crawled into my sleeping bag with my rifle beside me. I'd been in dangerous situations before. Bears, blizzards, getting lost in whiteout conditions. But I'd never felt fear like this. It was like the darkness itself was alive and watching me. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, something was moving around. Outside my tent. Footsteps, slow and careful, circling my camp. I grabbed my rifle and listened. The steps were too big to be human, too quiet to be a bear. And there was something else, a smell. Musky, like wet dog, but stronger. Much stronger. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just as I was starting to relax, something brushed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just a gentle touch, like fingers running along the fabric. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with an animal. Animals don't tease. They attack or they run away. They don't play games. I unzipped my tent door slowly and stuck my head out. The camp was empty, but there were new tracks in the snow. They led all around my tent in a perfect circle. Whatever had made them was testing me, learning about me, and the tracks were getting closer to my tent with each circle. I packed up fast. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I wasn't staying there anymore. As I loaded my snowmobile, I heard the howling again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the dunes. It was coming from the direction of the archaeological sites, from Onion Portage itself. Dr. Chen and her team had been digging at a new site there. They'd found something interesting, old burial sites that were thousands of years old. The university was excited because the artifacts were in perfect condition, preserved in the permafrost. Maybe whatever I was dealing with didn't like people digging up old graves. I started my snowmobile and headed toward Onion Portage. My headlights swept across the snow, and I saw them. More tracks. Not just wolf and human anymore. There were other marks in the snow, long scratches, like giant claws had raked across the ground. And they were fresh. The archaeological site was a mess. Someone had destroyed weeks of careful work in one night. The dig squares were torn up, tools scattered, tarps shredded. But the worst part was what I found in the main excavation area. Blood in the snow. Not a little bit. A lot. And buried in the disturbed earth, I found Dr. Chen's field notebook. The pages were torn, but I could still read some of her final entries. Day 12. Found burial chamber deeper than expected. Artifacts suggest ceremonial importance. Local Inupiat stories mention this as protected site. Day 13. Strange dreams last night. Felt like we were being watched during the dig. Day 15. Mike says he heard howling from the dunes. No wolves reported in this area. Team getting nervous. Day 16. Something wrong. Equipment keeps failing. GPS giving false readings. Satellite phone cutting out. Whatever we disturbed doesn't want us here. The final entry was just one line, written in shaky handwriting. It's not a wolf. I looked up from the notebook and saw them. Fresh tracks leading away from the dig site. Human footprints mixed with something else. Something that walked on four legs but left prints the size of dinner plates. The tracks led north, toward the heart of the dunes, where no one ever goes. I should have called for backup. I should have waited for daylight. I should have done a lot of things differently. But Dr. Chen and her students were out there somewhere. Maybe they were still alive. Maybe I could still save them. I followed the tracks into the darkness. The tracks led me deeper into the dunes than I'd ever been. My snowmobile struggled through the soft sand and snow. The headlight beam seemed weaker out here, like the darkness was swallowing up the light. After an hour of slow going, I had to stop. The engine was overheating, and I was getting low on fuel. I'd been so focused on following the trail that I hadn't paid attention to how far I'd come. When I cut the engine, the silence hit me like a wall. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just my own breathing and the tick of the cooling motor. I checked my GPS. It showed me somewhere impossible, or, according to the reading, I was 50 miles south of where I should be. But I knew exactly where I was. I could see the North Star through a gap in the clouds. My grandmother taught me celestial navigation when I was little. The GPS was lying. That's when I heard voices. Human voices, calling for help. Faint, but definitely there, coming from somewhere ahead in the dunes. Help us, please. It was Dr. Chen. I was sure of it. I grabbed my rifle and emergency pack and started walking toward the sound. The snow was knee-deep between the dunes, and each step was exhausting. But I could hear them calling. They were alive. "I'm coming," I shouted back. "Keep calling so I can find you." The voices stopped. I waited, listening hard. Nothing. "Dr. Chen? Can you hear me?" Silence. I kept walking in the direction I'd heard the voices. My flashlight beam swept back and forth across the empty dunes. The sand here was different, darker, and there were strange formations, pillars of sand and stone that didn't look natural. That's when I saw the first body, Mike Jeffries, one of the graduate students. He was buried up to his waist in sand, arms reaching up toward the sky like he'd been trying to climb out. His face was frozen in a scream. But that wasn't the worst part. The The worst part was the wounds. Deep scratches across his chest and throat. Too big to be from any animal I knew. And there was something else. The wounds were precise. Deliberate. Like whatever killed him had taken its time. I knelt down and checked for signs of life, even though I knew it was hopeless. He'd been dead for hours. The cold had preserved him, but the attack had been recent. As I was examining the body, I heard something that made me forget how to breathe. Dr. Chen's voice again, but it was coming from under the sand. Patricia? Patricia, help me. I'm trapped down here. I started digging with my hands, frantically scooping sand away from Mike's body. Maybe there was a cavity underneath. Maybe she'd fallen into some kind of hole. Where are you, Dr. Chen? Keep talking. I'm here, right here. The sand collapsed. I can't get out. But as I dug, I realized something horrible. The voice wasn't coming from under the sand. It was coming from Mike's body. From his dead mouth. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. Dead people don't talk. This wasn't possible. Patricia, Mike's corpse said in Dr. Chen's voice. Why won't you help me? I ran. I stumbled through the dunes, gasping and sobbing, not caring about the cold or getting lost. Whatever I was dealing with wasn't natural. It was something from my grandmother's stories, something that could mimic human voices and play with the living. I made it back to my snowmobile and started the engine with shaking hands. I had to get out of here, had to get back to the ranger station and call for real help. The military, the FBI, someone who dealt with impossible things. But when I tried to leave, the engine died. I tried to start it again. Nothing. The motor turned over but wouldn't catch. I checked the fuel gauge, still half full. I checked the spark plug, clean and dry. Everything looked normal. But the machine was dead. That's when the howling started again. Not from one direction this time. From everywhere. Like I was surrounded by a pack of giant wolves. I grabbed my rifle and stood back to back with the snowmobile, trying to watch all directions at once. My flashlight beam danced across the dunes, looking for movement. Then I saw them. Eyes. Glowing blue-white in the darkness. Not one pair. Dozens. They surrounded my camp in a perfect circle, just at the edge of my flashlight beam. But they weren't wolf eyes. They were too big, too intelligent. And they were all the same height. About 9 feet off the ground. Whatever was out there was huge. The eyes moved closer, slowly, carefully. I could hear breathing now, deep, rumbling breaths that seemed to shake the ground under my feet. Stay back, I shouted, raising my rifle. I'm armed. The breathing stopped. The eyes stopped moving. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then one of the creatures stepped into my light. It looked like a wolf, but wrong in every way. It was the size of a grizzly bear, standing 9 feet tall on its hind legs. Its fur was white as fresh snow, but marked with patterns that looked like ancient symbols. Its eyes glowed with their own light, like blue flames. But the worst part was its intelligence. This wasn't an animal. It was something far older and far more dangerous. It studied me with those burning eyes, tilting its head like it was trying to figure out what I was. When it opened its mouth, I could see teeth the size of railroad spikes. And then it spoke. Not in English. Not in any human language. But somehow I understood every word. You have disturbed the sleeping places. You have taken what was not yours to take. Now you must pay the price. The voice was like wind through ancient caves, like the sound of glaciers breaking apart. It seemed to come from inside my own head. The others tried to run. It continued. They begged and pleaded, but the law of this place is older than your kind. Those who steal from the dead become food for the guardians. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed up with fear. The creature took a step closer. Its massive paws left prints in the snow that were exactly like the ones I'd been following. But you are different, it said. You carry the blood of the people. Your grandmother sang the old songs. She knew the true names of the guardians. It knew about my grandmother. How was that possible? I am Amarok, the creature said. I am the guardian of this sacred place. For 1,000 years, I have protected the sleeping ancestors from those who would disturb their rest. The archaeology team awoke me from my slumber. Now they sleep forever in the sand. The other glowing eyes moved closer. I could see shapes now, more of the giant wolves, surrounding me completely. But you, Amarok continued. You can choose. Leave this place and never return. Swear by the old names that you will protect our secrets. Do this, and you may live. I found my voice. What about Dr. Chen and her students? Amarok's blue eyes flared brighter. They are part of the dunes now. Their bodies feed the ancient soil. Their spirits guard the burial places they disturbed. It is justice. They were just doing research. They weren't grave robbers. All disturbance is theft. All theft is desecration. This is the law. I looked around at the circle of glowing eyes. There had to be at least 20 of the creatures. Each one was big enough to tear me apart without effort. But I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she'd told me, about respect for the ancestors and the old ways. And I knew what I had to do. I lowered my rifle and set it on the ground. The giant wolves watched every movement, ready to attack if I made the wrong choice. My grandmother was Emma Moonhunter. I said, she was a healer for the Inupiat people of Kotzebue. She taught me the old songs when I was small. Amarok's massive head tilted. Speak her true name. I had to think. My grandmother had an Inupiat name that she only used in ceremonies. She'd taught it to me when I was 7 years old, making me promise to remember it always. Siku Takik, I said. Her name was Siku Takik. The effect was immediate. The other wolves stepped back, lowering their heads. Amarok's blue eyes dimmed to a softer glow. The ice healer? He said. Yes, I knew her. She sang to me in the old tongue when she was young. She brought offerings to the sacred places and asked permission before taking anything from the land. Hope flickered in my chest. Then you know, I'm not here to steal or harm anything. I came to find missing people. It's my job to protect them. Your job, Amarok growled, is to protect this place from people like them. You wear the badge of the park guardians, but you have forgotten your true duty. He was right, and I knew it. I'd been so focused on archaeology and science that I'd forgotten the spiritual side of my job. My grandmother always said the land itself was alive, that it had to be treated with respect. The archaeology team didn't know, I said. They weren't told about the sacred sites. They just saw old bones and artifacts. Ignorance is not innocence, Amarok replied. They were warned. The land itself warned them, equipment failures, strange dreams, the feeling of being watched, but they chose to continue. They chose to dig deeper. I thought about Dr. Chen's notebook. She had mentioned all those things, but she'd explained them away as natural phenomena, just like I always did. Show me where they are, I said. Let me see what happened. Amarok studied me for a long moment. Then he turned and began walking deeper into the dunes. The other wolves followed, creating a moving circle around me. I had no choice but to walk with them. We traveled for what felt like hours. Though time seemed strange here, the landscape kept changing in ways that shouldn't be possible. Dunes that had been in front of us suddenly appeared behind us. Stars moved across the sky too quickly. Finally, we stopped at a place where the sand was different. Darker, older. Ancient stone formations jutted up from the dunes like broken teeth. This is Kimiklu, Amarok said, the place of the dog spirits. Your people knew it as the most sacred burial ground in all the North Country. The archaeology team called it Site 12 and marked it with flags and stakes. I could see the excavation now. Someone had been digging here recently. There were tools scattered around and the careful grid pattern that archaeologists use, but everything was covered in that dark sand. They found the burial chamber 3 days ago, Amarok continued. 10,000 years of sleep, broken by metal tools and cameras. The ancestors cried out, and we answered. He led me to the edge of the main dig site. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see down into the excavated area. There were bones there, human remains that were incredibly old, but they weren't lying peacefully like they should be in a proper burial. They'd been disturbed, catalogued, photographed, and mixed in with the ancient bones were newer remains. Dr. Chen and her students. They didn't die quickly, Amarok said, reading my expression. We gave them the choice you were given, but they chose to fight instead of flee. They chose to defend their theft instead of asking forgiveness. I stared down at the bodies of people I'd never met, but had been trying to save. Dr. Chen was still holding her camera. One of the students had a measuring tape in his hand. They died doing what they thought was important work. This isn't justice, I said. This is murder. Amarok's eyes flared bright again. The other wolves moved closer. You question the law of the Guardians? I was terrified, but I held my ground. I question killing people for doing their jobs. They were scientists, not grave robbers. There is no difference. Yes, there is. Dr. Chen was trying to learn about your people's history. She wanted to understand and preserve it. Our history is not for outsiders to preserve. Our ancestors are not specimens for outsiders to study. He was right again. I'd spent years working with archaeologists who claimed to respect native cultures while digging up native graves. We called it science, but from Amarok's perspective, it was just another form of colonization. What would you have them do? I asked. Ignore the sites? Let development destroy them? We would have them ask permission, make offerings, show respect, learn the proper ceremonies, treat the ancestors as family, not as objects. I thought about that. In all my time working with archaeology teams, I'd never seen anyone perform ceremonies or ask permission from the spirits. We had permits from the government, but we never asked the dead. It's not too late, I said. I can change how we do things. I can make sure future digs are done with respect. Amarok studied me again. You would do this? You would risk your job to protect our ancestors? Yes, it was a simple word, but it changed everything. As soon as I said it, I felt something shift inside me. My grandmother's teachings, which I'd always thought of as superstition, suddenly felt real and important. Then you must prove it, Amarok said. There's a ritual, a way to make peace between your kind and ours, but it requires sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Instead of answering, Amarok led me to a flat stone at the center of the burial ground. The surface was carved with symbols that seemed to move in my flashlight beam. Place your hand here, he said, and speak the words of binding. Swear by your ancestor's name that you will protect this place. But know this, if you break the oath, you will join the Guardians forever. I looked at the stone, then at the giant wolf waiting for my decision. The other wolves had formed a circle around us, their eyes glowing like blue stars. I thought about Dr. Chen and her students, dead because they didn't understand what they were dealing with. I thought about my grandmother, who would have known better. I thought about all the future archaeology teams who might come here looking for artifacts and knowledge. I placed my hand on the stone. The surface was warm, which shouldn't have been possible in this cold. But as soon as I touched it, I felt energy flowing through the rock. Ancient power, older than memory. I swear by Sikutakik's name, I said, that I will protect this sacred place and all the ancestors who rest here. I will make sure no one disturbs the burial sites without proper ceremony and permission from the spirits. The stone grew warmer under my palm. The carved symbols glowed with the same blue light as Amarok's eyes, and I felt something change inside me, a connection to the land that I'd never experienced before. When I lifted my hand, there was a mark on my palm, a wolf print that glowed faintly in the darkness. It is done, Amarok said. You are bound to us now, guardian to guardian, but you are still human. You can return to your world and do what must be done. The other wolves began to fade into the darkness, disappearing like they'd never been there. But Amarok remained. Remember, he said, we are always watching. The ancestors are always listening. Honor the old ways, or join the action. Eternal hunt. Then he too vanished, leaving me alone in the burial ground with the dead. I made it back to my snowmobile just as dawn was breaking. The machine started on the first try, like it had never been broken. My GPS showed the correct location again. Even my satellite phone worked. I called headquarters and reported that Dr. Chen's team had been killed by wolves while camping near sacred burial sites. It wasn't exactly a lie. The Park Service sent a recovery team, but they never found the bodies. The dark sand had swallowed them completely. The official report listed it as an animal attack, unusual, but not impossible in Alaska. The university suspended all archaeological work in Kobuk Valley indefinitely. The burial sites were declared off-limits to researchers. I never told anyone about Amarok or the other guardians. Who would believe me? But I kept my promise. Over the years, I've turned away dozens of research teams. I've shut down illegal artifact hunters. I've made sure the sacred sites stay protected. Sometimes people get angry. They complain to my supervisors. They threaten to have me fired. But I have help now. When trespassers ignore my warnings and sneak into the protected areas anyway, they usually come running out a few hours later. They talk about strange howling sounds and giant wolf tracks. They never try to come back. The mark on my palm never faded. Sometimes, on clear nights when the aurora dances across the sky, it glows blue-white like Amarok's eyes. It reminds me that I'm not just a park ranger anymore. I'm a guardian, protecting something far older and more important than any government agency. My grandmother would have been proud. Last month, a new archaeology team contacted the Park Service. They wanted to study the Onion Portage sites, but they approached me differently than Dr. Chen's team had. Their leader was an Inupiat woman from Nome. She knew the old protocols. "We'd like to ask permission from the ancestors," she said. "We want to learn their stories, not steal their bones." I took her to the sacred sites, but not alone. I brought one of the tribal elders from Kotzebue, a man who still remembered the proper ceremonies. We spent 3 days making offerings and singing the old songs. On the third night, I felt Amarok's presence in the darkness. But this time, he wasn't angry. This time, he was curious. The archaeology team got their permission. They're working at the sites now, but they do things differently. They ask before they dig. They make offerings before they take photographs. They treat the ancestors like family. And at night, when the work is done, I sometimes see blue lights moving through the dunes. Not threatening, just watching, making sure the old laws are respected. I'm 43 now. In a few years, I'll retire from the Park Service. But I'll never stop being a guardian. The mark on my palm makes sure of that. And someday, when I'm too old to patrol the dunes myself, I'll find someone younger to teach. Someone who understands that there are things in this world that can't be explained by science. Things that demand respect instead of study. The Kobuk Dunes keep their secrets well. Tourists come and go, taking pictures of the sand and snow. They never see the blue lights in the darkness. They never hear the howling when the wind is still. But I do. And I always will. Because some promises are forever. Some guardians never rest. And some places remain sacred, no matter how much the world changes around them. The ancient ones are still sleeping in the dark sand. And I'll make sure they keep sleeping peacefully, protected by laws older than civilization itself. That's what guardians do. We protect what matters most, no matter the cost. Even in the howling darkness of Kobuk. My name is Vincent Shadowpine, and I've been a forest ranger in Alaska for 14 years. I've fought 89 wildfires, tracked countless lost hikers, and survived a grizzly bear attack that left 3 scars across my back. I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. I was wrong. The call came in on September 15th, 1991. 3 hunters had gone missing in the old-growth section of Chugach National Forest, about 50 miles east of Anchorage. Standard stuff. City guys who probably got turned around and would stumble out hungover and embarrassed in a day or two. "Vincent, you need to check the Prince William Sound area," my supervisor told me over the radio. Last contact was 2 days ago. They were supposed to check in yesterday morning. I loaded my gear into the boat, emergency supplies, first aid kit, flare gun, and my trusty Pulaski fire tool. The weather was getting nasty, with early autumn storms rolling in and the daylight already shrinking to 8 hours. Pretty soon, we'd have 16-hour nights, and nobody wanted to be lost in the woods when that happened. The boat ride took 3 hours through choppy water. Dark clouds hung low over the forest, making everything look gray and cold. As I got closer to their last known location, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized what it was: the silence. Usually, these woods are full of life. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant splash of salmon in the streams. But as I tied up my boat and stepped onto the muddy shore, I heard nothing but the wind through the trees. I found their camp about a mile inland. 3 tents set up in a neat triangle, cold fire pit, food still hanging from a bear pole. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. They'd left all their gear behind. Wallets, car keys, even their hunting rifles. Nobody leaves their rifles in bear country. I radioed back to headquarters. Found the camp. No sign of the hunters, but all their equipment is here. Looks like they left in a hurry. Any sign of animal attack? Came the reply. I looked around carefully. No torn fabric, no blood, no obvious signs of struggle. Negative. Site looks clean. I'm going to start a search pattern. That's when I noticed the trees. Now, I've spent half my life in these forests. I know every type of spruce, hemlock, and cedar. I can tell you how old a tree is just by looking at it. And I remember landmarks better than most people remember street addresses. But the big spruce tree that should have been 50 yards north of their camp was now 30 yards southeast. A massive tree, at least 200 years old, in completely the wrong place. I shook my head. Maybe I was remembering wrong. The 1964 earthquake had done strange things to this area. Shifted the ground, created new streams, knocked down whole sections of forest. Maybe my mental map was off. I started my search pattern, marking trees with bright orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it got. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, not even the sound of small animals moving through the underbrush. My compass started acting weird around noon. Instead of pointing north, the needle kept swinging toward a cluster of old-growth spruces about a quarter-mile away. I tapped the glass, thinking maybe I'd damaged it somehow. Probably iron deposits from the earthquake, I muttered to myself, messing with the magnetic field, but I'd never seen anything like it before. I found the first piece of evidence at 2 p.m., a torn piece of flannel shirt caught on a branch about 8 feet off the ground. Way too high for a person to have snagged it walking by. I bagged it for the search team and kept looking. The woods felt wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. After 14 years of walking through forests, you develop a sense for how things should feel. These trees felt angry. I know how that sounds. Trees don't have feelings. They're just wood and bark and leaves. I'd always explained away the creaking and groaning sounds as wind and settling wood. When other rangers talked about forests that felt alive, I laughed it off. But standing there in that quiet grove, with my compass spinning like a broken toy, I started to understand what they meant. The light was getting dim when I found the second piece of evidence, a hunting boot, size 10, sitting neatly at the base of a hemlock tree. Not dropped or lost, but placed there carefully, like someone had taken it off and set it down. The weird thing was, the tree wasn't there that morning. I was sure of it. I'd walked this exact path 3 times during my search pattern, and I would have remembered a hemlock that size. It was at least 60 years old, not something that just appears overnight. I marked the spot with GPS coordinates and took photos. The boot had a name written inside, Marcus Webb, one of the missing hunters. As darkness fell, I made camp near the shore and radioed in my findings. The response was scratchy with static, but I could make out the important parts. A botanist named Dr. Sage Greenwood would arrive in the morning to help with the investigation. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The lap of water against the shore, the creak of branches, the whisper of wind through leaves. But sometime around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. Someone was calling my name. Vincent. Vincent. A man's voice, faint but clear, coming from deep in the forest. Not one of the missing hunters. I'd heard their voices on the 911 recording. This was different. Older. Sadder. I grabbed my flashlight and listened hard, but the voice didn't come again. Just the wind through the trees. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Dr. Sage Greenwood arrived the next morning in a float plane, along with her research equipment and enough scientific gear to study a whole forest. She was about my age, with graying hair and the kind of calm confidence you only get from years of field work. Ranger Shadowpine? I'm Dr. Greenwood. I understand you found some unusual tree behavior? I almost laughed. That's one way to put it. Follow me. I led her to the spot where I'd found the boot. The hemlock was still there, exactly where it shouldn't be. Dr. Greenwood pulled out a tool that looked like a big metal straw. An increment borer, she called it. She drilled a small hole into the tree and extracted a thin core of wood. Interesting, she said, examining the sample. This tree is definitely 60+ years old, but the root displacement suggests it was moved recently. Moved? It weighs several tons. I know. That's what makes it interesting. She looked around at the other trees, then at her compass. Your magnetic readings are accurate. There's definitely some kind of interference in this area. We spent the morning documenting everything: the moved trees, the strange compass readings, the complete absence of wildlife. Dr. Greenwood took soil samples, photographed bark patterns, and measured tree positions with GPS. Around lunchtime, we found the second boot, and the third, and a wallet, all placed neatly at the base of trees that I was absolutely certain had moved during the night. This doesn't make sense, I said, studying my photos from the day before. This birch tree was 20 feet to the left yesterday. Dr. Greenwood was quiet for a long moment, comparing her own measurements. Vincent, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you noticed any unusual sounds coming from the trees? I stared at her. What kind of sounds? Voices, whispers, people calling for help. The hair on my neck stood up. You've heard them too? She nodded grimly. Since about an hour after we started working, faint but definitely human voices. They seemed to be coming from inside the tree trunks. That's when we heard it clearly for the first time. A man's voice, muffled but distinct, coming from the big spruce tree about 50 feet away. Help me, please. I can't move my legs. We both froze. Dr. Greenwood pulled out a small recorder and pointed it toward the tree. Hello? I called out, where are you? The voice came again, weaker this time. Inside, it's so dark, can't breathe. I grabbed my Pulaski and started toward the tree. But Dr. Greenwood caught my arm. Wait, look at the bark. I looked. The rough bark of the spruce seemed to be shifting. Not moving exactly, but changing pattern, like wood grain rearranging itself. And in the center of the trunk, about 6 feet up, something that looked like a human face was forming. A face twisted in pain and terror. Jesus Christ, I whispered. The face became clearer, a middle-aged man with a gray beard. His mouth moved, and the voice came again. Please, don't leave me. It won't let me go. I recognized him from the missing person photos. Marcus Webb, one of the hunters. Marcus? Marcus, can you hear me? We're going to get you out of there. But even as I said it, the face began to fade back into the bark pattern. Within minutes, it was just wood grain again. Dr. Greenwood was recording everything, her hands shaking slightly. In 30 years of botany research, I've never seen anything like this. The cellular structure of the bark seems to be incorporating organic matter. You mean the trees are eating people? I mean, something is using the trees as a medium, something that can manipulate wood and root systems on a massive scale. We spent the rest of the day marking every tree that had moved, every spot where we'd found personal items. By late afternoon, we had identified over 40 trees that were definitely not where they should be. The pattern was becoming clear. The trees were forming a rough circle, about 500 acres in diameter, and we were standing right in the center. As the sun started to set, Dr. Greenwood tried to radio for pickup, but the floatplane pilot couldn't be reached. The radio crackled with static, and underneath the static, we could hear voices. Dozens of voices, all crying for help. We need to get out of here, I said. But when I looked toward where we'd beached the boat that morning, there was nothing but forest. The shoreline had moved, or we had moved, or the trees had created a maze where none existed before. Vincent, Dr. Greenwood said quietly, look around us. I turned in a slow circle. Every tree within 100 yards had a face in its bark now. Some were clearer than others, but they were all there. Men, women, even a few children, all trapped, all pleading silently for rescue. And they were all looking at us. That's when the trees started to move, not slowly, like plants growing, but like living creatures turning to face us. Branches reaching out like arms, roots breaking through the ground like grasping fingers. The faces in the bark began to speak all at once, a chorus of trapped voices begging for help, warning us to run, telling us it was already too late. The earthquake, Dr. Greenwood said, her voice barely audible over the growing sound. The 1964 earthquake. It must have damaged something, released something. A massive root burst from the ground between us, thick as my waist and covered in what looked like human hair. Then another. We ran. The forest had become a nightmare maze. Trees that had been stationary for decades were now moving like slow, wooden giants. Every path we tried led us deeper into the circle instead of out. Dr. Greenwood stumbled over a root and went down hard. When I helped her up, her hand was bleeding from where she'd scraped it against bark. "Look at this," she said, staring at the wound. The blood wasn't just red, it was mixing with something dark and sticky that was seeping from the tree bark. Sap, but not normal sap. This stuff was thick like blood and smelled like decay. "The trees are bleeding," she whispered. I touched the bark where her blood had mixed with the dark sap. The surface was warm, like skin. And underneath, I could feel something pulsing. A heartbeat. "We need to find higher ground," I said. "Get above the canopy and see what we're dealing with." There was an old fire tower about half a mile north, or at least there had been yesterday. In this shifting forest, I couldn't be sure of anything. We pushed through the undergrowth, dodging, grasping branches and roots that seemed to predict where we were going. The voices from the trapped people were getting louder, more desperate. "Don't go that way," a woman's voice called from a cedar tree. "It's waiting for you." "What's waiting?" I shouted back. "The old one, the hungry one. It's been sleeping since the ground shook, but now it's awake." A child's voice joined in from a smaller birch. "It wants to add you to the collection. It wants to keep you forever." Dr. Greenwood grabbed my arm. "Vincent, look at your compass." The needle wasn't spinning randomly anymore. It was pointing steadily toward the center of the circle, toward what looked like the biggest, oldest tree I'd ever seen. A massive Sitka spruce that had to be 300 years old, rising nearly 200 feet into the darkening sky. And it was walking toward us, not swaying in the wind, walking. Each step took about 30 seconds, but the huge trunk was definitely moving, its root system tearing up the ground as it pulled itself along. "That's it, Doctor," Greenwood said. "That's the source. Some kind of forest guardian spirit, probably corrupted by the earthquake damage. How do we stop a 300-year-old haunted tree? I don't know, but I know what it wants." She pointed at the faces and the bark around us. "It's collecting people, absorbing them into the forest, making them part of itself." The giant spruce was getting closer, and I could see why it was moving so slowly. Its trunk was covered with faces, hundreds of them. Not just the three hunters, but people from all different time periods. Native Alaskans, Russian fur traders, gold miners, loggers, all trapped in the bark, all still aware, all still suffering. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Probably centuries, but the earthquake damaged whatever was keeping it contained. Now it's spreading." The ground shook with each step of the massive tree. Smaller trees around us began forming a tighter circle, herding us toward the giant like sheep toward slaughter. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me about the old Tlingit stories. Forest spirits that protected the woods but could be corrupted by violence and death. And I remembered something else, how the old-timers used to deal with corrupted spirits. Fire. "Dr. Greenwood, do you have any accelerant in your research kit?" "Some ethanol for preserving samples." "Why?" "Because I think I know how to stop this thing. But we need to get to that fire tower first." We made a run for it, dodging, grasping branches, and sidestepping roots that erupted from the ground like wooden snakes. The tower was still there, thank God, though it was now surrounded by trees that definitely hadn't been there before. I started climbing the metal ladder, Dr. Greenwood right behind me. About halfway up, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down to see a branch wrapped around my boot, and in the bark of the branch, a face I recognized from the missing person reports. One of the hunters. "Don't burn the forest," he pleaded. "We're all in here. You'll kill us." "I'm sorry," I said, and chopped through the branch with my Pulaski. From the top of the tower, we could see the full scope of what we were dealing with. The moved trees formed a perfect spiral pattern, with the giant corrupted spruce at the center. And the spiral was getting tighter, drawing in more trees from the healthy forest around it. "It's growing," Dr. Greenwood said, "spreading the corruption through the root system. In a few days, it'll reach the main forest. In a few weeks, the whole national forest could be infected." The giant tree was almost to the base of our tower now. Up close, I could see that the faces in its bark weren't just human anymore. There were animal faces too. Bears, deer, eagles, salmon, Everything the forest spirit had absorbed over the centuries. And at the very center of the trunk, about 40 feet up, was a face that made my blood run cold. It was huge, ancient, with eyes like dark pits and a mouth that stretched across 6 feet of bark. The original spirit, the forest guardian that had been corrupted into something hungry and evil. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through 1,000 dying trees. Vincent Shadowpine, your family has walked these woods for generations. Your uncle died in the Great Shaking. Would you like to join him? I looked closer at the faces in the bark, and there he was, Uncle Robert, who'd been killed in the 1964 earthquake. His face was twisted in eternal pain, but his eyes were still aware, still human. "Let them go," I shouted. "Take me instead." The ancient face laughed, a sound like breaking branches. "I will take you. But first, I will take your friend." Branches shot up from below, wrapping around Dr. Greenwood's legs. She screamed as they pulled her toward the edge of the platform. "The ethanol," I yelled. "Throw me the ethanol." She tossed me the bottle just as the branches yanked her over the side. I watched in horror as she was drawn into the bark of the giant tree, her face appearing in the wood even as her body disappeared into it. Now I was alone, 40 feet above a corrupted forest spirit with the power to control every tree for miles around. But I had fire, and I had a plan. The giant spruce shook the fire tower like a dog shaking a toy. Metal bolts snapped, and the whole structure tilted at a crazy angle. I had maybe minutes before it collapsed completely. I pulled out my emergency flare gun and loaded it with a phosphorus round. The ethanol went into my water bottle, along with some cotton batting from my first aid kit. An improvised Molotov cocktail. "You cannot burn me, little ranger," the ancient voice rumbled from below. "I am older than your people. I was here when the ice covered this land." "Maybe," I said, lighting the cotton wick. "But you weren't always evil." I threw the burning bottle at the base of the giant tree. The ethanol caught immediately, blue flames racing up the corrupted bark. The faces in the woods screamed in unison, not in pain, but in relief. The ancient spirit's roar shook the ground. "You are killing them." "No," I said, firing the flare directly into the crown of the tree. "I'm setting them free." The fire spread faster than any normal forest fire should. This wasn't just burning wood. It was burning the spiritual corruption that had infected the tree. The flames were silver and blue, not orange and red. As the fire climbed the trunk, the faces in the bark began to dissolve. But instead of dying, they turned into wisps of light that rose up through the smoke. Souls being released after decades or centuries of imprisonment. I saw Uncle Robert's face one last time before it transformed into light. He smiled at me, the first peaceful expression I'd seen on any of the trapped faces. The ancient spirit fought back, sending roots and branches crashing against the fire tower. But the spiritual fire was spreading to the other corrupted trees, cleansing them one by one. The whole infected area was burning with that strange silver light. "This forest was my body," the spirit wailed. "These people were my voice. What am I without them?" And suddenly I understood. The spirit wasn't evil by nature. It had been driven insane by the 1964 earthquake, by the trauma of having its forest body damaged and its animal children killed. It had started absorbing people not out of hunger, but out of desperate loneliness. "You can rest now?" I called out as the fire reached the top of the giant tree. "The forest will grow back, clean and healthy." The ancient face looked up at me one last time. For a moment, the madness left its eyes, and I saw what it had been before the corruption. A guardian, a protector, a force of nature trying to keep its forests safe. "Thank you," it whispered, and then the face dissolved into silver light that rose up into the storm clouds. The fire burned for 6 hours, but it never flashed, spread beyond the corrupted area. When it was done, 500 acres of infected forest had been reduced to ash. But it was clean ash, purified ash. I climbed down from the damaged tower just as the rescue helicopter arrived. The pilot had been trying to reach us for hours, but the radio interference had finally cleared. "Ranger Shadowpine? Thank God you're alive. What happened to Dr. Greenwood?" I looked at the field of ash where the giant tree had stood. In the center, something glinted in the morning sunlight. Her research notebook, somehow untouched by the fire. "She didn't make it," I said. The official report blamed the missing hunters on bear attacks. Dr. Greenwood's disappearance was listed as an accident during the forest fire that spontaneously ignited due to unusual atmospheric conditions. The 500 acres were declared off-limits due to geological instability from earthquake damage. I never told anyone the real story. Who would believe it? But I kept Dr. Greenwood's notebook. In her final entries, she'd written about similar reports from other areas affected by the 1964 earthquake. Forests where hikers disappeared, where trees moved on their own, where people reported hearing voices from the woods. The earthquake hadn't just damaged the land. It had damaged the barriers between our world and the spiritual realm that exists alongside it. And if one forest guardian could be corrupted, I put in for a transfer to the Kenai Peninsula 6 months later. There had been reports of unusual tree behavior near the earthquake epicenter. Campers going missing, strange sounds in the night. I'm 52 now, and I've spent the last 14 years quietly dealing with spiritual corruption in Alaska's forests. Sometimes it's just a single tree that's absorbed a lost hiker. Sometimes it's something bigger. The ethanol and flare gun method works, but only if you catch the infection early. Once a corrupted spirit spreads through the root system, you need something stronger. The old Tlingit ceremonies work, if you can find an elder willing to teach them to a white forest ranger. I've saved 11 people over the years. I've had to burn down 3 more corrupted groves. And I've learned to listen to the trees, not just the corrupted ones, but the healthy ones too. They know when something is wrong in their forest. Last week, I got a call from a park ranger in Washington state. Trees moving overnight near Mount Rainier. Hikers reporting voices from the forest. Equipment showing magnetic anomalies. Mount Rainier sits on a major fault line. I'm packing my gear now. The ethanol, the flare gun, the ceremonial sage that Elder Mary Goldthroat taught me to use. Because somewhere south of here, trees are whispering names in the darkness. And they're hungry. The official records will tell you that Vincent Shadowpine died in a forest fire in 1992, the same fire that killed Dr. Sage Greenwood. But if you're ever camping in the Pacific Northwest and you hear trees moving when there's no wind, if your compass starts pointing the wrong way, if you hear voices calling for help from inside the bark, look for the ranger with the flare gun and the fire axe. Look for the man who learned that some forests don't want visitors to leave. I'll be there. Because after 30 years of walking in these woods, I've learned something that's not in any forestry manual. Some jobs don't end when you clock out. Some responsibilities follow you for the rest of your life. The trees are still whispering my name, and I'm still listening. My name is Margaret Beartrack, and I've been a park ranger at Katmai National Park for 18 years. People always think that's a funny name for someone who works with bears, but it came from my great-grandmother. She was Aleut, and she said it meant Pearl Bear Follower. Growing up, I thought it was just a pretty story. Now I know better. I'm the Chief Bear Safety Coordinator here at Katmai, which means I spend most of my time making sure people don't get eaten by grizzlies. It's February 1996, and normal folks think I'm crazy for being out here in the dead of winter. But winter is when I do my best work, checking den sites, monitoring hibernation patterns, getting ready for the spring tourists who'll come looking for the perfect bear photo. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes isn't like other places. It got its name after the big eruption in 1912, when Mount Katmai blew its top and buried everything under volcanic ash. Even now, 84 years later, steam still rises from the ground in places. The whole valley looks like the moon, all gray and empty, stretching for miles under the Alaska sky. I've seen a lot in my years here. Mama bears protecting cubs, tourists who think they're smarter than a 1,000-pound grizzly, and yes, even the occasional strange thing I couldn't quite explain. But I'm a practical woman. I believe in what I can see, touch, and measure. That's what kept me alive when a bear nearly took my head off back in '79. Stay alert, trust your training, and don't let your imagination run wild. My partner this winter is Dr. Ember Fieldstone, a volcanologist from the University of Alaska. She's here to check on the thermal activity in the valley. The mountain's been acting up lately, more steam vents opening, ground temperatures rising in weird patterns. Nothing dangerous, she says, but worth keeping an eye on. We flew in 3 days ago on a ski plane, just the two of us, and enough supplies for a week. The pilot, Joe Talkeetna, wasn't happy about leaving us out here. Radio don't work good with all that volcanic interference, he said, checking his watch. I'll be back Thursday, weather permitting. You ladies, be careful. I laughed at that. I've been careful for 18 years, and I'm still here. Our base camp sits about 2 miles from the main thermal field, close enough to do our work, but far enough to avoid the worst of the sulfur smell. Ember set up her equipment yesterday, seismometers, thermal sensors, all kinds of fancy gadgets that beep and flash. I stuck to what I know, checking bear sign, looking for tracks, making sure no grizzlies decided to wake up early from their winter sleep. That first night, everything seemed normal. Cold, quiet, peaceful. The kind of silence you only get in the deep wilderness, where the loudest sound is your own breathing. I've always loved that silence. It means I'm doing my job right. The bears are sleeping safe. The valley is at peace. But this morning, something felt different. I woke up to Ember shaking my shoulder, her face pale in the dim tent light. Margaret, she whispered, you need to see this. Outside, the world had changed overnight. Fresh snow covered our campsite, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual were the tracks. Bear tracks, huge ones, leading right through our camp and disappearing toward the thermal field. I knelt down and studied them in the beam of my flashlight. These weren't just big, they were massive, bigger than any grizzly track I'd ever seen, and I've seen some monsters in my time. The front paws were nearly a foot long, with claw marks that gouged deep into the frozen ground. When did you first notice them? I asked Ember. About an hour ago, she said, hugging herself against the cold. I got up to check my seismometer readings, and there they were. Margaret, these tracks lead right between our tents. That bear walked within 3 feet of where we were sleeping. I followed the trail with my light. The tracks were perfectly clear in the fresh snow, showing every detail. But something bothered me about them, something I couldn't put my finger on. Then I realized what it was. There were no approach tracks. The trail just started, right at the edge of our camp, like the bear had dropped out of the sky. I've been tracking bears since I was 12 years old. My dad taught me to read, sign, the way other kids learn to read books. Every track tells a story. Where the bear came from, where it's going, how fast it was moving, whether it was scared or calm or hunting. These tracks told a story that made no sense. Ember, I said, standing up and brushing snow off my knees, show me your seismometer readings from last night. We hiked over to her equipment station, a collection of sensitive instruments that could detect even tiny movements in the earth. The readout screen showed a steady green line for most of the night, then a series of sharp spikes starting around 3 a.m. See these vibrations? Ember pointed to the spikes. They're consistent with large animal movement, something heavy walking across the ground. But look at the pattern. I studied the readout. The spikes showed footsteps all right, but they were too regular, too evenly spaced, like a machine walking, not a living animal. Bears don't walk like that, I said, especially not in winter. They lumber, they shamble, they stop to sniff around. This thing walked in a perfectly straight line for. I counted the spikes, 200 yards. Never stopped. Never changed pace. Ember nodded. And here's the really weird part. Watch this. She switched to a different readout, one that showed ground temperature. For most of the night, the line stayed steady at -15 degrees. But during the time of the footsteps, it spiked upward. The ground temperature along that path rose to over 100 degrees, Ember said, for about 20 minutes. Then it dropped back to normal. I stared at the screen. That's impossible. I know. I checked the sensors 3 times. They're working fine. We followed the tracks away from camp, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the thermal field. The trail led us past our camp perimeter, through a grove of stunted birch trees, and out onto the open ash flats. That's where things got really strange. The tracks continued across the ash field, clear as day in the snow. But after about 50 yards, they started to change. The impressions got shallower, like the bear was getting lighter, then lighter still. Finally, they just stopped. Right in the middle of nowhere, with no cover for miles around, the tracks simply ended. No bear, No disturbance in the snow beyond that point. Nothing. It was like the animal had just vanished into thin air. I knelt down and examined the last clear print. The details were sharp. Individual toe marks, claw gouges, even the texture of the paw pad. This was definitely from a real bear. But where did it go? Maybe it climbed a tree, Ember suggested. I looked around. The nearest tree was a quarter-mile away, and it was barely 8 feet tall. No way a bear that size could reach it in a single jump. Maybe it doubled back on its own trail? I checked. The snow around the last track was completely undisturbed. Nothing had walked here except whatever made these prints. We spent the next hour searching in ever-widening circles, looking for any sign of where the bear might have gone. We found nothing. It was like the animal had simply ceased to exist. By noon, we'd given up the search and returned to camp. I tried to focus on my normal work, checking my maps, updating my bear activity log, reviewing safety protocols, but I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. 18 years in the wilderness, and I'd never seen anything like it. That afternoon, while Ember worked on her thermal readings, I decided to check some known den sites deeper in the valley. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for what we'd seen. I hiked out to Bear Creek, about 3 miles from our camp. There's a hillside there where grizzlies like to dig their winter dens, nice and protected from the wind. I'd marked 12 active dens in the fall, all of them sealed up tight for the winter. What I found made my blood run cold. Every single den had been torn open from the inside. Not by people, not by machinery. The claw marks on the torn earth and broken rocks could only have come from bears. But these weren't the neat, careful excavations you see when bears wake up naturally in spring. These looked violent, desperate, like something had exploded out of the ground. I checked each den carefully. They were all empty now, but the floor of each one was covered with a thick layer of volcanic ash. Not the old, settled ash from 1912. This was fresh stuff, still warm to the touch. At the 7th den, I found something that made me sit down hard in the snow. Bones. Lots of them. They were scattered around the den entrance like some kind of gruesome decoration. Most were from fish and small mammals, normal bear food. But mixed in with them were pieces I recognized from my training courses at the Ranger Academy. Human bones, old ones, yellowed with age. I should have hiked straight back to camp right then. Should have radioed for an emergency pickup, assuming our radio could punch through the volcanic interference. Should have followed every protocol in the book about potentially dangerous situations. Instead, I kept investigating, because those bones looked familiar somehow, and I needed to know why. I gathered up the human remains and examined them in the fading afternoon light. They were definitely old, 50 years at least, maybe more. The bones were stained with what looked like volcanic ash, and they had a strange, almost glassy texture in places. Then I saw the metal. Mixed in with the bones were bits of old equipment. A corroded brass button, fragments of what might have been a belt buckle, and a piece of tarnished metal that took me a minute to identify. It was a park ranger badge, the old style they used back in the 1942nd. I turned it over in my hands, brushing away decades of grime. The inscription was barely legible, but I could make out a name, J. Beartrack, my grandfather, Joseph Beartrack, who'd worked as a guide in this valley before it became a national park, who'd died in some kind of accident in 1946, according to family stories. His body was never found. Now I knew why. That's when I heard the roar. It came from somewhere behind me, deep and rumbling like a landslide. But it wasn't a landslide. I've heard enough bear calls to know the difference between a warning, a challenge, and a threat. This was definitely a threat. I spun around, pulling my bear spray from its holster. The sound had come from the direction of camp, about 3 miles away. Too far for a normal bear call to carry, especially in this thin air. But this hadn't sounded like a normal bear. I started running back toward camp, my snowshoes throwing up clouds of powder with each step. The roar came again, closer this time, and I could hear something else underneath it, a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe. I was still a mile from camp when I saw the smoke. The smoke was rising from our campsite in a thick black column that looked wrong against the gray winter sky. Not the clean smoke from a campfire, this was oily, chemical smelling like burning plastic. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning in the cold air. Through my binoculars, I could see our tents were still standing, but something was definitely wrong. The snow around our camp had turned dark, and there were shapes moving in the smoke. Big shapes. I was about half a mile out when I heard Ember screaming. Her voice carried across the valley, high and terrified. She was calling my name over and over, begging for help. I could hear the panic in her voice, the kind of fear that comes when someone realizes they're about to die. I dropped my pack and ran the last quarter mile on pure adrenaline. The smell hit me before I could see clearly. Sulfur and rotting meat, mixed with something else that made my stomach turn. Like burning hair. Our camp was in chaos. Equipment scattered everywhere, tents partially collapsed, and the snow trampled into a gray slush. But what caught my attention first were the thermal vents. Where there had been empty ground that morning, hot springs were now bubbling up from beneath the earth. Steam rose from a dozen new openings, carrying with it the stench of deep earth and decay. The temperature around our camp had to be 40 degrees warmer than it should be. "Ember," I called out, pulling my bear spray. "And flare gun, where are you?" Her answer came from behind our equipment cache, weak and shaky. "Margaret, thank God, don't come over here. Please don't come over here." But I was already moving, following her voice. I found her crouched behind a pile of supply boxes, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was staring at something I couldn't see, her whole body shaking. "What happened?" I knelt down beside her, scanning the area for threats. "Are you hurt?" "It's not possible," she whispered. "What I saw. It's not possible." "What did you see?" She pointed with a trembling hand toward the largest thermal vent, about 50 feet from where we crouched. It came out of there, out of the ground, like it was climbing up from hell itself. I looked where she was pointing but saw only steam and bubbling mud. "What came out, Ember? What did you see?" "A bear." Her voice was barely audible, but not like any bear that should exist. It was huge, Margaret, 12 feet tall at least, and it was covered in ash and steam, like it was made out of the volcano itself. I kept my eyes on the thermal vent while I processed this. Ember was a scientist, trained to observe and report facts. She wasn't prone to hysteria or hallucinations. "Where is it now?" "I don't know." It looked right at me for maybe 10 seconds. Its eyes were glowing, like coals in a fire. Then it just faded away, like smoke. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were everywhere around our destroyed camp, pressed deep into the now muddy ground. The same massive bear prints we'd seen that morning, but these were different. These ones glowed with a faint red light, like the ash inside them was still burning, and they were still warm. I could feel the heat radiating up from them through my boots. "We need to get out of here," I said, helping Ember to her feet. "Right now." But as we gathered what supplies we could carry, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices. Human voices, calling from somewhere in the thermal field, faint and distant, but definitely people shouting for help. "Did you hear that?" I asked Ember. She nodded, her eyes wide. "But Margaret, we're the only ones out here. The pilot won't be back for 2 days." The voices came again, clearer this time. A man calling, "Help us, please, we're trapped." Then a woman's voice. "The bears. Oh God, the bears are coming." Ember grabbed my arm. "We have to help them." But something about those voices bothered me. They sounded wrong somehow, too clear for the distance they seemed to be coming from. And there was an echo to them, like they were coming from underground. "No," I said firmly, "we're leaving, now, but there are people out there. Ember, listen to me. I've been working this valley for 18 years. I know every person who's authorized to be out here in winter. We are alone." The voices came again, closer now. A whole group of people, men and women, all screaming for help. They sounded like they were just beyond the next ridge, maybe a quarter mile away. That's when I recognized one of them. Margaret Beartrack, help me." It was my grandfather's voice. Joseph Beartrack, who'd been dead for 50 years. "We have to go," I said, grabbing Ember's pack and pulling her away from camp. "Whatever's making those sounds, it's not human." But as we started to leave, the thermal vent erupted. Not like a geyser, like an explosion. Superheated mud and steam shot 30 feet into the air, and something came out of the ground with it. The bear Ember had described rose from the vent like a nightmare made real. 12 feet of muscle and fury, covered in volcanic ash that glowed like embers. Its fur looked burned and blackened, hanging in patches from flesh that seemed to pulse with internal heat. Its eyes were indeed like coals, burning yellow-red in a skull that was too large, too predatory to be from any normal animal. Steam rose from its body in constant clouds, and where its feet touched the ground, the snow hissed and melted instantly. It turned its massive head toward us, and I could see intelligence there, malevolent, ancient intelligence. It spoke, not with words, but with a sound that formed meaning directly in my mind. A voice like grinding stone and rushing wind. Asterisk, bear track. You return to the Forbidden Valley. Asterisk. My great-grandmother's stories came flooding back. Tales she'd told me as a child, about the fire bears that guarded the sacred places. About what happened when the mountain exploded in 1912, and why the Alu people refused to hunt in this valley anymore. The creature took a step toward us, each footfall leaving a glowing print in the mud. More steam vents opened around it, and I could hear other sounds coming from underground. Growls and roars from things that had been sleeping beneath the earth for decades. Run, I whispered to Ember. The bear roared, a sound like a freight train mixed with a volcanic eruption. Every thermal vent in sight responded, shooting pillars of steam and superheated water into the air. The temperature around us spiked so high that my eyebrows felt like they were burning. We ran. Behind us, I could hear more creatures emerging from the ground. The voices of the dead called after us, pleading and threatening in equal measure, and underneath it all was the sound of massive paws on earth that glowed with its own heat. We ran through the valley of 10,000 smokes while hell itself gave chase. We made it about 2 miles before Ember collapsed. She went down hard in the snow, gasping for breath in the thin air. Her face was bright red from exertion and fear, and when I helped her sit up, I could see she was reaching her limit. I can't, she panted. I can't run anymore. I looked back toward our camp. The smoke was visible for miles now, a black column rising straight up into the gray sky. And moving through that smoke, I could see shapes, lots of them. The spirit bears were following our trail, but they weren't hurrying. They didn't need to hurry. There was nowhere for us to run. Ember, listen to me, I said, kneeling beside her in the snow. I need to tell you what's really happening here. She looked up at me with exhausted, terrified eyes. My great-grandmother was Aleut. She told me stories about this place, stories I thought were just folklore. According to the old tales, this valley was a sacred place where bears came to die. A spiritual crossing point between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Ember shook her head. Margaret, this isn't the time for. When Mount Katmai erupted in 1912, I continued, it wasn't just a volcanic explosion, it was a spiritual disaster. The eruption trapped dozens of bears here during their sacred time, killing them while they were protecting their cubs. They died in agony, buried alive under thousands of tons of ash and superheated rock. The sounds behind us were getting closer, not just footsteps now, but voices. The voices of every person who died in this valley over the past century, calling out in a chorus of the damned. Those bears never found peace, I said. They're still here, still trying to protect their cubs that died 84 years ago. And they see anyone who enters their valley as a threat. Ember stared at me like I'd lost my mind. You're talking about ghosts, about supernatural. Look behind you, I said quietly. She turned around and went completely still. They were coming across the ash field in a line, like soldiers advancing into battle. I counted at least a dozen of them, massive spectral grizzlies wreathed in volcanic steam and glowing ash. Each one was unique in its horror. Some were missing limbs, torn away in the eruption. Others had skulls cracked open, or rib cages exposed. All of them burned with that internal fire, that rage that had kept them conscious and hunting for nearly a century. At their head was the largest bear I'd ever seen, the one that had emerged from our camp. It had to be the alpha, the patriarch of this ghostly family. And walking beside it, translucent but clearly visible, was the spirit of a man in an old park ranger uniform, my grandfather, Joseph Beartrack. They killed him, I whispered, understanding flooding through me. In 1946, He came into the valley to investigate reports of unusual bear activity. They killed him because he was a bear track, because they thought he should have known better than to violate their sacred ground. The spirit bears stopped about 100 yards away from us. The alpha reared up on its hind legs, towering 16 feet into the air, and roared. The sound shook snow from the mountains around us and sent flocks of ravens exploding into the sky. Then it spoke again, that voice like grinding stone, forming words in my mind. Asterisk, bear track blood returns to pay the debt. The sacred valley demands justice. Asterisk, I stood up slowly, leaving my weapons in the snow. What debt? Asterisk, your grandfather led the metal birds here, the ones that brought fire from the sky, the ones that killed our cubs. Asterisk, metal birds, airplanes. In 1946, the military had conducted some kind of training exercise in this area. According to the family stories, that's when grandfather disappeared. The bombing runs? I said, pieces falling into place. They were using the valley for target practice, weren't they? Bombing the ash fields. Asterisk, the cubs had found refuge in the deep caves, safe from the fire mountain, safe from the burning air. Then the metal birds came. The explosions brought down the cave roofs, crushed the little ones while they slept. Asterisk, I could see them now, faintly visible in the steam around the adult bears. Dozens of ghost cubs, their spirits still clinging to their parents, after all these years. Some were so young they would have still been nursing. Others were nearly grown but stayed close to their mothers out of fear and confusion. They'd been dead for 84 years, but they were still babies. Still frightened. Still needing protection. Grandfather was trying to help you, I said. He was investigating the bombing, trying to get it stopped. Asterisk. He brought them here. Bear track blood calls to the sacred places. He opened the way for the destroyers. Asterisk. The ghost bear dropped back to all fours and began walking toward us again. The others followed, forming a circle that slowly contracted. There was nowhere to run, and even if there had been, I was tired of running. What do you want from us? I called out. Asterisk, justice, the debt of blood. Bear track dies so the cubs can rest. Asterisk, that's when I understood. These bears hadn't been hunting randomly all these years. They'd been waiting for another bear track to return to, their valley, so they could complete their revenge. My family name was both my inheritance and my death sentence. But looking at those ghost cubs huddled around their parents, I realized something else. They weren't evil. They were just lost, confused, and in pain. For nearly a century, they'd been trapped in this valley, unable to move on to whatever came next because their deaths had been so violent and unjust. There's another way, I said, my voice carrying across the snow. Let me help them find peace. The alpha bear paused, its burning eyes fixed on me. I know the old rituals, I said. My great-grandmother taught them to me. The Alat ceremonies for honoring the spirits of the dead. Let me sing them home. For a long moment, nothing moved except the steam rising from the bears' bodies. Then, slowly, my grandfather's ghost stepped forward. He looked exactly like the old photographs I'd seen as a child, but translucent and flickering like a heat mirage. When he spoke, his voice was distant and sad. Margaret, he said, you look like your grandmother. Why didn't you leave the valley, grandfather? Why did you stay with them? Someone had to witness, he said. Someone had to remember what happened here. The cubs. They needed someone to sing them to sleep. I knelt down in the snow and began to sing. The song was old. Older than the reservation schools, older than the Russian traders, older than any written history. It was a song my great-grandmother had taught me when I was 5 years old, a song for helping lost spirits find their way home. As my voice rose and fell, carrying the ancient Ala words across the valley, the ghost cubs began to respond. They moved away from their parents for the first time in 84 years, drawing closer to me with curiosity rather than fear. The adult bears watched, their burning eyes never leaving my face. But they didn't attack. Something in the song was calming them, easing the rage that had kept them trapped for so long. I sang about the great hunting grounds beyond the sky, where salmon run forever and no volcano can touch the sacred places. I sang about cubs who would never need to fear again, and parents who could finally rest knowing their children were safe. One by one, the ghost cubs began to fade. Not disappearing, but transforming. The ash and fire fell away from them like shed skin, revealing cubs that looked healthy and whole and ready for whatever came next. As the last cub faded into peaceful light, the adult bears began to change too. The rage left their eyes first, then the fire went out of their ash-covered fur. They were still massive, still clearly supernatural, but no longer filled with that ancient, consuming anger. The alpha bear approached me slowly, each step leaving cooling prints in the snow. When it was close enough to touch, it spoke one final time. Asterisk, the debt is paid, bear track. The cubs are free. We are free. Asterisk. Then it too began to fade, and my grandfather's spirit with it. But before he disappeared completely, grandfather pressed something into my hand. His old ranger badge. The same one I'd found in the den that afternoon. Take care of this valley, he whispered. It's sacred ground. Then they were gone, all of them, leaving only Ember and me alone in the snow, as the thermal vents slowly stopped steaming and the temperature began to drop back to normal. The pilot found us 3 days later, sitting by a small fire near the ruins of our camp. We'd spent those days in a strange kind of peace, watching the valley slowly return to its normal winter quiet. The thermal vents had sealed themselves, the glowing tracks had cooled and filled with snow, and the voices of the dead had finally fallen silent. Joe Talkeetna took one look at our destroyed equipment and the scattered remains of our camp and started asking questions we couldn't answer. What the hell happened out here? He demanded, loading our salvage gear into the plane. Looks like a bomb went off. Volcanic activity, Ember said without looking at him. Thermal vents opened up overnight. We lost most of our equipment. It was technically true. Joe accepted it because it was the kind of thing that happens sometimes in places like this. The wilderness was dangerous and unpredictable, and experienced people sometimes got caught off guard by natural forces beyond their control. The official report listed the incident as equipment failure due to unexpected geothermal activity. The Park Service decided to classify the thermal field as temporarily unstable and off-limits to visitors. No one questioned why a volcanologist and a bear expert had both recommended the closure. Ember quit her job at the university 2 months later. She never talked publicly about what she'd seen in the valley, but she also never returned to volcanic research. Last I heard, she was teaching high school, geology in Anchorage, staying as far away from active thermal areas as possible. I stayed on at Katmai for another 12 years before retiring. During that time, I made regular trips back to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Not for bear surveys or thermal monitoring, but to make sure the peace we'd helped create was holding. The valley stayed quiet. No more mysterious tracks, no more voices in the steam, no more equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained by ordinary science. The ghost bears had finally found rest, and their cubs were free to move on to whatever waited beyond. But I wasn't naive enough to think the supernatural had completely left the area. Alaska is full of old places with old pain, mountains where the spirits of miners still search for gold, forests where trappers who froze to death continue their endless rounds, rivers where the ghosts of salmon runs, destroyed by human greed, still swim against currents that no longer exist. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes was just one of many sacred places where the boundary between life and death had worn thin. And while the bear spirits were at peace now, other things had noticed the attention they'd drawn. On my final official trip to the valley, just before my retirement, I found tracks in the ash that didn't belong to any bear, living or dead. Deeper than they should be, with claw marks that looked more like knife cuts. The trail led from the old thermal field toward the crater of Mount Katmai itself, and I had the distinct feeling that something else was stirring in the deep places beneath the mountain. Something that had been sleeping even longer than the ghost bears. I filed a report recommending that the valley remain closed to public access indefinitely. I cited ongoing seismic instability and unpredictable thermal activity. The Park Service accepted my recommendation without question, and the Valley of 10,000 Smokes was quietly reclassified as a restricted research area. But late at night, when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear my grandfather's voice carried on the air from somewhere far up the valley, not calling for help anymore, not trapped in pain and confusion, just singing the old songs, keeping watch over a sacred place that finally knows peace. My name is Margaret Beartrack, and I spent 30 years protecting people from bears. But in the end, it was the bears who protected me from something far worse. The realization that some debts can only be paid with understanding, and some spirits can only find peace through love. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes is closed now, marked on maps as geologically unstable. Most people think it's empty, just another stretch of volcanic wasteland where nothing lives and nothing grows. They're wrong. It's fuller than it's ever been, but full of things that belong there, things that have finally found their way home. And sometimes, on the clearest winter nights, you can still see the aurora borealis dancing above the valley in patterns that look almost like running bears, playing with their cubs in fields of light that stretch all the way to the stars. My name is Samuel Icewolf, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 22 years. I know cold like most people know their own backyard. I know when it's the kind that nips at your nose, and I know when it's the kind that can kill you in minutes. But I never knew cold could hunt you until that December in 1998. I work in the Noatak National Preserve, way up north where the Brooks Range Mountains scrape the sky. It's 300 miles from the nearest road, and in winter, you get there by snowmobile or dog sled, or you don't get there at all. My job is helping the Inupiat people with their subsistence hunting, making sure they can feed their families the way their ancestors did for thousands of years. People call me Ice Wolf because my grandmother was Inupiat, and she taught me the old ways. How to read the ice, how to know when a storm's coming by the way the wind smells, how to survive when the temperature drops so low that spit freezes before it hits the ground. She also told me stories about the Tornarsuk, ice spirits that lived in the deepest, coldest places. I always figured they were just stories to teach kids to be careful around thin ice. I should have listened better. It started with a radio call on December 15th. The voice was crackling with static, but I could make out enough to know something was wrong. 3 Inupiat hunters, Tommy Kayutak, his brother Billy, and old Peter Ninguluk, hadn't come back from their caribou hunt. They'd been gone 4 days. In normal cold, that might not mean much. These guys knew the land better than anyone. But this wasn't normal cold. We were in the middle of a cold snap that had the weather service scared. 60 below zero with wind that made it feel like 80 below. The kind of cold that turns your breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The kind that freezes diesel fuel solid. The kind that makes the trees crack like gunshots in the night. I packed my gear, survival suit, emergency shelter, enough food for a week, and my grandfather's rifle. It was an old Winchester that had never let my family down. I also grabbed something I hadn't touched in years, the medicine bag my grandmother made for me. She'd sewn it from sealskin and filled it with things she said would protect me from the Tornarsuk. Carved bone, dried herbs, a small piece of meteoric iron. I'd always kept it, but I'd never really believed. Mary Snowsong met me at the trailhead with her dog sled. Mary was the traditional healer for the local village, and she knew these hunters better than anyone. She was worried, I could tell, but Mary never showed fear easy. "Something's not right out there, Samuel," she said as we loaded my snowmobile onto her sled. "The dogs won't go past Wolverine Creek, they just stop and whine. Dogs know things people don't." That should have been my first real warning. We made good time for the first 20 miles, following the hunters' snowmobile tracks. The trail was clear in the snow, 3 machines heading northeast toward the traditional hunting grounds near the upper Noatak River. But as we got closer to Wolverine Creek, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The tracks were strange. Not the snowmobile tracks, those were normal. But around them, in the snow, there were other marks. Long grooves, like something heavy had been dragged, and patterns in the ice along the creek that looked almost like shapes, like someone had carved animals into the frozen surface. "Mary," I called out, stopping my snowmobile. "You see this?" She pulled up beside me and looked where I was pointing. The ice formations along the creek bank weren't random. They looked like crouching wolves, like bears rearing up on their hind legs, like human figures bent low to the ground. The detail was incredible. You could see muscle definition, individual teeth, even what looked like fur texture. "Ice doesn't form like that," I said. Mary was quiet for a long moment, studying the formations. Then she reached into her parka and pulled out a small bundle of dried sage. She lit it with her lighter and let the smoke drift over the strange ice shapes. "It does when something makes it," she said. We found the hunters' camp just after noon, and that's when I knew we were dealing with something beyond my training as a park ranger. The camp was there, but it wasn't there. Let me explain. The hunters had set up their tent in a small clearing about 50 yards from the river. I could see the tent, a bright orange dome that stood out against the white snow like a traffic cone. I could see their snowmobiles parked nearby, covered with frost. I could see their gear scattered around the campsite exactly like hunters would leave it. But the whole camp was encased in ice. Not covered with ice, like what happens when freezing rain hits. Encased, like someone had taken the entire campsite and dipped it in liquid, ice that froze instantly. The tent was perfectly preserved inside a shell of clear ice 3 inches thick. The snowmobiles looked like they were displayed in an ice museum. Even their coffee pot was sitting on their camp stove, frozen solid with black ice in a perfect cylinder inside. "This isn't possible," I said, walking around the camp. My breath was coming in short puffs, not just from the cold, but from fear. Ice doesn't form like this, not naturally. Mary was examining the ground around the camp. The snow was disturbed in wide circles, and there were those drag marks again. Lots of them, leading away from the camp in different directions. "Samuel," she called, "look at this." She was pointing at the ice that surrounded the tent. I walked over and looked closer. Inside the clear ice, I could see movement. Something dark was shifting around inside the tent. "Are they alive in there?" I asked. Before Mary could answer, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, colder than the air around us. It was knocking. Someone inside that ice-covered tent was knocking on the walls. I ran to my snowmobile and grabbed my emergency axe. If Tommy and his brother and Peter were alive in there, I had to get them out. But when I swung the axe at the ice, something impossible happened. The ice repaired itself. I watched the crack I'd made seal up like a healing wound. The ice didn't just freeze over the crack, it flowed back together like it was alive. "We need to get them out of there," I said, swinging the axe again. "No," Mary said firmly, "that's not them anymore." The knocking from inside the tent was getting faster, more urgent. But Mary was right. As I looked closer at the dark shapes moving inside the ice-covered tent, I could see they weren't moving like people. They were moving like things pretending to be people. Their arms bent wrong, their heads turned too far. "Then what are they?" "Bait," Mary said. That's when I heard the sound behind us. It was like wind, but there was no wind. It was like something large moving through snow, but when I turned around, nothing was there. Except the ice formations along the riverbank had changed. The carved ice animals I'd seen earlier were in different positions. The wolf that had been crouching was now sitting up. The bear that had been rearing up was now on all fours. And there was a new one, a tall, thin human shape that hadn't been there before. "Mary," I said quietly, "we need to leave, now." But when I turned to my snowmobile, the engine wouldn't start. The pull cord was frozen solid. Mary's dog sled was the same. Her dogs were huddled together, whining and refusing to move. That's when we heard the voices. "Help us." It was Tommy's voice, coming from somewhere in the trees. "Help us, we're trapped." "Samuel," that was Billy, calling from a different direction. "Samuel, we're hurt." And from a third direction, "Please." Peter's voice, weak and scared. "Something's hunting us." I knew it was a trap. I knew those weren't really the hunters calling for help. But hearing voices of people I'd known for years, people who might be dying while I stood there doing nothing, it was almost impossible to resist. Mary grabbed my arm. "Those aren't them," she said. "Look." She pointed at the snow around us. There were no human footprints leading to where the voices were coming from. But there were those drag marks, and something else. Holes in the snow, perfectly round, about the size of a quarter. They led in straight lines toward each voice, like something had been testing the snow with a rod or spear. The voices called again, closer this time, more urgent. "Help us. We're bleeding. It's coming back." And then I saw it, just a glimpse, moving between the trees where Tommy's voice was coming from. Something tall and white, almost invisible against the snow. But not quite. It was shaped like a person, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, and when it moved, it didn't walk. It flowed, like water freezing in fast forward. That's when my snowmobile started working again. Mary and I got out of there fast, but the thing followed us. I couldn't see it directly, but I could feel it behind us as we raced our snowmobiles through the forest. Every time I looked back, there was just empty snow and trees. But the temperature kept dropping. My breath was turning to ice crystals so fast they were cutting my face. The engine on my snowmobile was running rough, fighting against cold that was trying to freeze the fuel lines. "There!" Mary shouted over the engine noise, pointing ahead. About a quarter mile in front of us, I could see a small cabin. It was one of the old trapper shelters scattered throughout the preserve. Basic log construction, but solid and warm. We could hole up there, figure out what we were dealing with. But as we got closer, I realized the cabin was wrong too. The logs weren't brown anymore. They were white, ice white. The entire cabin had been coated with ice so thick it looked like it was carved from a glacier. The windows were opaque with frost, and ice hung from the eaves and spears that nearly touched the ground. "Don't stop!" Mary yelled. But it was too late. Both our snowmobiles died at the same time, just 50 feet from the cabin. The engines didn't sputter or cough. They just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. We climbed off and looked around. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing but the distant crack of trees splitting in the cold. And it was getting colder. I could feel it through my survival suit, a cold that had nothing to do with weather. "We need shelter," I said. "Even if that cabin's covered in ice, it's better than being out here." Mary shook her head. "Look at the door." The cabin door was open about 6 inches. Not unusual, old hinges, settling wood, wind could all cause that. But there was no wind. And through that gap, I could see light, warm, yellow light, like a fire was burning inside. "Someone's in there," I said. "No," Mary said, "something's in there." As if it heard us, a voice called out from the cabin. A woman's voice, sweet and scared. "Hello? Is someone out there? Please, I need help." It was a voice I knew. Sarah Kanguk, a teacher from the village. She'd been missing for 3 days. "Sarah?" I called back. "Sarah, is that you?" "Samuel, oh thank God, I'm trapped in here. Something's outside, hunting me." Every instinct I had as a ranger told me to help her. But every instinct my grandmother had given me told me to run. "She's been missing for 3 days," I told Mary. "If that's really her." "It's not," Mary said firmly. But I was already walking toward the cabin. I got about 10 feet from the door when I saw the tracks. They went right up to the cabin door, human footprints in the mulch, snow. But they only went one direction. Footprints going into the cabin, but none coming out. And they were wrong somehow. Too deep, like whoever made them was much heavier than they looked. "Samuel, please," the voice called again. "It's so cold in here." I reached the door and looked through the gap. Inside, I could see a fire crackling in the old stone fireplace. The cabin looked warm and normal, and sitting by the fire, with her back to me, was a woman with long black hair. She was wearing a heavy parka, and she was shivering. "Sarah?" I said, pushing the door open a little wider. The woman turned around. It had Sarah's face, but it was wrong. The features were too sharp, too perfect. And her eyes were the pale blue of deep ice, so light they were almost white. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth were too white, too sharp. "Help me, Samuel," she said. "I'm so cold." Behind me, Mary was saying something, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own heart pounding. The thing that looked like Sarah stood up and walked toward the door. With each step, frost spread across the cabin floor. The fire in the fireplace started to dim. "Let me out, Samuel," she said. "I just want to get warm." I stepped back, but the thing kept coming. As it got closer to the door, the air around me got colder. My breath turned to ice so fast it felt like snow. The metal handle of my axe was so cold it burned my hands through my gloves. "Don't let it out," Mary yelled from behind me. But I wasn't going to, because as the thing that looked like Sarah got closer to the door, I could see what was really there. It wasn't Sarah at all. It was ice in the shape of Sarah. Ice that moved like a person, talked like a person, but was still ice, and underneath the human shape, I could see something else. Something with too many arms, too many teeth, and eyes like holes in a glacier. I slammed the door shut and ran. Mary was already starting her snowmobile. Somehow, the engines worked again. We took off through the forest, but I could hear the cabin door opening behind us. And then I heard the most terrible sound I've ever heard in my life. It was laughter. But not human laughter. It was the sound of ice cracking under pressure, of glaciers breaking apart, of winter itself enjoying a good joke. We were being hunted by something that had been waiting a very long time for prey, this stupid. We didn't stop until we reached Raven Ridge, about 5 miles from the cabin. My snowmobile was running on fumes, and Mary's dogs were exhausted, but we were alive, which was more than I'd expected an hour ago. What the hell was that thing? I asked, as we caught our breath behind a stand of spruce trees. Tornarsuk, Mary said. Ice spirit. They live in the deepest, coldest places where the permafrost never melts. Climate change has been warming the shallow ground, so they're coming up from deeper ice. And they're hungry. Hungry for what? Heat, life. They eat the warmth right out of living things. Mary was setting up a small fire with dried wood from her pack. I wanted to tell her that a fire would give away our position, but I was so cold I couldn't think straight. The cold was getting inside my survival suit somehow, settling into my bones. The hunters, I said. Tommy and Billy and Peter. What happened to them? Tornarsuk caught them, drained their body heat, left them as ice shells. But the spirits can use those shells, make them move, make them talk. Use them as bait for more prey. The fire caught, and for a moment I felt human again. But then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Snowmobiles, coming our way. Get ready to run, I told Mary. But she was staring into the forest, and her face had gone white. 3 snowmobiles were coming up the ridge toward us. I could see the riders clearly in the moonlight, Tommy, Billy, and Peter. They looked normal, alive, human. They were waving at us like they were happy to see us. Samuel, Tommy called out as they got closer. Mary, thank God you found us. They pulled up about 20 feet away and shut off their engines. Up close, they looked perfect. Not a mark on them, not even frost on their parkas. They looked better than normal, like the cold wasn't affecting them at all. Where have you been? I asked. We found your camp. It was covered in ice. Ice? Billy laughed. What ice? We've been looking for you guys. Radio's been dead, thought maybe you were in trouble. Everything they said sounded right. Their voices were perfect, their mannerisms exactly what I'd expect. But Mary was backing away from the fire, and I could see her reaching for something in her parka. Show me your breath, she said suddenly. What? Tommy asked. Your breath. It's 60 below. Show me your breath. That's when I saw it. They weren't breathing vapor into the cold air. They were breathing, but no fog was coming out of their mouths. And now that I was looking closer, they weren't shivering either. They were standing in 60 below weather in normal winter gear, and they looked comfortable. Mary, Peter said, taking a step toward us. What's wrong? It's us. But as he got closer to the fire, something impossible happened. The fire started to die down. Not like it was running out of fuel, like something was sucking the heat right out of it. Stay back, I yelled, pulling my grandfather's rifle. Samuel, Tommy said, and his voice was different now, colder. You're making a mistake. The 3 figures started walking toward us, and with each step they took, the air got colder. My rifle was so cold, the metal was burning my hands through my gloves. The fire behind us went out completely. That's when Mary threw something at them. It was a small bundle of herbs from her medicine bag, and when it hit the ground in front of the 3 ice things, it burst into flames. Bright white flames that hurt to look at. The things that looked like Tommy and Billy and Peter screamed. But it wasn't human screaming. It was the sound of ice breaking, of glaciers calving into the sea. And as they screamed, their human shapes started to melt away. What was underneath wasn't human at all. They were tall, maybe 8 feet, and made of ice so clear I could see through them. But inside the ice, there were darker things. Bones, bits of fur, what looked like human hair. They had arms that were too long and ended in claws like icicles. Their faces were holes in the ice with teeth like broken glass. Run, Mary yelled. But there was nowhere to go. The Tornarsuk had surrounded us, moving fast across the snow like skating. I fired my rifle at the closest one, and the bullet went right through it like it was shooting at water. The hole it made sealed up instantly. One of them reached me before I could reload. Its claw raked across my chest, cutting through my survival suit like paper. Where it touched me, instant frostbite spread across my skin. I could feel the warmth being sucked right out of my body. I was going to die. And then I remembered my grandmother's medicine bag. I pulled it out and threw it at the tornarsuk, attacking me. When the bag hit its ice body, the creature let out that horrible cracking scream and stumbled backward. Where the bag had touched it, the ice was turning black and crumbling. "The meteoric iron," Mary yelled. "They can't touch meteoric iron." I grabbed the piece of meteoric iron from my medicine bag and held it out like a weapon. The tornarsuk hissed and backed away, but I could see more of them coming through the trees. Dozens of them, all different sizes, all hungry for the warmth in our bodies. That's when Mary did something that saved our lives. She pulled a flare from her emergency kit and fired it into the sky. But she didn't fire it up, fired it at the largest tornarsuk, the one that had been wearing Tommy's shape. The flare hit its center mass, and the entire creature exploded in a shower of boiling water and steam. "Fire!" she yelled. "They can't handle real heat." I grabbed the emergency flare gun from my pack and started shooting. Every flare hit one of the ice creatures and turned it into superheated steam. But there were so many of them, and we only had 6 flares between us. When the last flare was gone, there were still a dozen tornarsuk left, and they were moving in for the kill. That's when we heard the helicopter. The helicopter came in fast and low, a military Black Hawk with searchlights blazing. But it wasn't the lights that drove off the tornarsuk. It was the heat from the engines. The ice spirits scattered like vampires from sunlight, flowing away into the deeper forest, where the cold was their friend. In 30 seconds, we went from being surrounded by supernatural predators to standing alone in the snow, watching a helicopter land in the clearing. The crew that got out wasn't Park Service. They were military, in Arctic gear that looked expensive. The squad leader walked over to us with the kind of confidence that said he'd dealt with things like this before. "Mr. Icewolf, I'm Captain Rodriguez. We're here to extract you. How did you know where to find us?" "We've been tracking the temperature anomalies in this area for the past week. When things drop 40 degrees below normal in a localized area, that usually means tornarsuk activity." Mary and I looked at each other. This guy knew about ice spirits. The military knew about ice spirits. "How long has this been going on?" I asked as they loaded us into the helicopter. "Climate change is thawing permafrost that's been frozen for thousands of years," Rodriguez said. "Things that have been sleeping in deep ice are waking up. This is the 14th incident in Alaska this winter." As we flew back to base, I thought about what he'd said. 14 incidents. How many people had died? How many more would die as the climate kept warming and more ancient things woke up from their ice sleep? They debriefed us at Elmendorf Air Force Base, and they were very clear about what we could and couldn't say. The official report would list Tommy, Billy, and Peter as victims of extreme weather exposure. The ice formations we'd seen would be explained as unusual atmospheric conditions. The tornarsuk would remain classified. "People aren't ready for this," Rodriguez explained. "If word got out that supernatural predators are emerging from melting permafrost, it would cause panic. And panic won't help us deal with the problem." "What about the people living out there?" I asked. "The Inupiat villages? They have a right to know what's hunting them. The traditional communities already know," Rodriguez said. "They never forgot. It's the modern world that needs to catch up." He was right. Mary and the other traditional healers had known exactly what we were dealing with. They'd kept the old knowledge alive, even when people like me thought it was just stories. I went back to my job as a park ranger, but everything was different now. I carried my medicine bag every day. I learned the traditional protection ceremonies from Mary and the other elders, and I started teaching other rangers about the signs of supernatural activity, the temperature drops, the strange ice formations, the sounds that weren't quite right. But mostly, I watched the weather reports. Every time there was an unusual cold snap, every time the temperature dropped below normal in an isolated area, I knew something ancient was stirring. Something that had been sleeping in the deep ice for thousands of years, waiting for its chance to hunt again. The worst part isn't the ice spirits themselves. They're dangerous, but they can be fought with traditional knowledge and modern weapons. The worst part is knowing that as the climate keeps changing, more things are going to wake up. Things that have been frozen in permafrost since the last ice age. Things that are hungry after sleeping for so long. My grandmother used to say that ice remembers everything. She was right. And now the ice is melting, and everything it remembers is coming back. 3 weeks after our encounter, I got another radio call. Temperature anomaly near Kobuk Lake. Hunters missing. Strange ice formations. I packed my gear, including my grandfather's rifle and my grandmother's medicine bag, and headed out into the cold. Because someone has to stand between the warming world and the ancient hunger that's waking up. Someone has to be ready for what's coming next. My name is Samuel Icewolf, and I hunt the things that hunt us. In Alaska, the cold doesn't just bite anymore. It feeds.